Good everything, Nubians. Hi. Hi, how art thou? Hi.
Hey,
Hi, Dr. Carr.
hey, Professor Hunter. Good everything.
Yes, yes.
Everyone.
It's a beautiful day. I was out in the rain, thinking about how many people hate the rain, and I was like, it's nice, it's warm, it's a warm little drizzle, light drizzle. It's nature cleansing itself, and it's nice. I think about all of the songs about being out in the rain, so nobody knows you're crying.
The mighty intruders. I want to go outside. May sound crazy. Might sound crazy, but yes, indeed. I think that's the intruders, isn't it? Yeah, in the rain.
Mine is the what was it? The uh, I want to go. Well, I'm not gonna sing, but
Go ahead. Come on now. Come on now. Come
no, no,
on
no. Nope, you good. This your space. But there's another outside
now.
the rain. So no one knows that I'm crying. That
Yeah,
one. And there's some people, that one.
yeah.
Forgot who
I
that
thought that was the intruders. Maybe no. Then of course there's Orange Juice Jones. I saw you.
was. So you and him.
In him walking in the rain. You cold busted. And then of course there's Missy Elliott actually was borrowing from the blues. I can't stand the rain.
Yeah.
It's my window. Yes, bringing back those memories. It's something about water though.
What is it?
I mean, what how do you feel when you're out there in that water?
Well, usually I used to hate, rain made depressed me because it was like, oh, the sun's not out because I love the sun. I love the sun, the water,
Of course.
the ocean, and all. But I've learned to appreciate, nature in a different way in all of its forms. And I guess it's like, evolving as a human being because we have to appreciate human beings in all of our forms as well, because together we make whole. We make wholeness when we're whole
Hmm.
ourselves. So for me, it's just, reconnecting, and it now gives me a sense of peace and joy, which I probably didn't have before with it.
That's so interesting. I mean, what brings us peace? What brings us joy? I'm pulling up the app here so I can go live and say
Do
hello to
that.
everybody at the same time. The what brings us peace and joy? Water. So funny you say that. Wholeness with a WHOLE. Whole. I was talking yesterday with a brother, Chris Manjapra, who is a professor up at Tufts. He's written about colonialism. He's got a new book. I would love to hear the two of you all talking. It's called Black Ghost of Empire: The Long Death of Slavery and the Failure of Emancipation.
Mm.
He's
Wait,
from.
can you hold that up again? Because
Oh yeah, sure.
I'll be writing stuff down.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
Black Ghost of Empire: The Long Death of Slavery and the Failure of Emancipation. His name is Chris Manjapra.
Mm.
Interesting brother. This is him actually. He's from Barbados. And you can see his face.
Oh wait, hold on. Let me single post that. Hold on.
Yeah, good brother, Chris Manjapra. He's at Tufts University. But most importantly, he is an African from not Barbados, from Bermuda. But he talks about how um, I'm sorry, I keep saying Bermuda. I always want to say Bermuda. He's from the Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, Bahamas, very different places. But Bahamas, of course, Sidney Poitier's place. And he was talking about how he was there, and over the millennia, the water eats these holes in the bedrock of the island, and and it creates what they call these blue holes, and they can go miles deep. And he says you look down in them, and they're incredibly beautiful, but they give you a sense of a void. But then he said he was looking into one of the holes, and he experienced the sensation of being in conversation and community and connection with his great grandmother, who he never knew. But he's a researcher. He's writing about enslavement, colonialism, the price we've paid, the ravages, the ways we've resisted. So it's a beautifully written book. And he opens it by saying, in going there to ask about her, no one in living memory knew anything about her because she had made transition before the oldest person that he could find had been born. But whereas he was looking in this hole, he felt, he said, and it transformed from a void to a connection. He said the water is a connecting thing. It reminds me of Danny Black. And so when you said that today, I said, oh, that's, yeah, you know.
Dr. Carr, how do you find these books?
Because I'm constantly reading. Like, for example, this book, Black Ghost of Empire, this is what'll happen. I mean, I will go into not a bookstore, into bookstores. So I just wander around, and it takes me maybe a couple of minutes in a black section, so to speak, because I know all those books. I know them by color and the spine. I've read a lot of them, but the ones I don't recognize, I'll pull. So this one I saw in an academic bookstore, and I don't even remember where I got this one from. Sometimes if I pay for them and get a receipt, I'll stick it in as a bookmark. And I say, "You want your receipt?" I say, "Yeah, it's my bookmark," and I can tell you, but no. Anyway, so I looked at it, and how else can I say? How else do I do? If I hear somebody talking, I'll make a note, and then I just add it in my mind. So I start looking for books, and then if I find an author or a subject, I will then look for more on that subject. Like, by reading this book, I found out about this book he wrote, Colonialism and Global Perspective. This is a book he wrote before. This book, he traces colonialism through the last 500 years, but I found it fascinating because it's a two-part book where he organizes it not around chronology, but around theme. Part one, interlocking colonial histories, war, primarily invasion. That's what we're dealing with. Settlement, settler colonialism. Plantation, the forms of labor then we use to draw us out. And then port. So the ports are very important. Again, coming back to that water theme in a minute, because, obviously water plays such an important role in Randall Robinson's life, as we'll talk about in a minute. And then part two, elementary aspects of colonial power, science, school, and debt. Debt, very important. We had a pretty good conversation just about debt. Anyway, but so yeah, and then last thing I'll say is, in terms of how I find written stuff, books and articles and magazines, and technology obviously is very helpful. There are probably some Nubians in here now and folks later who will be looking these books up, and I encourage you to, because he's an excellent writer, particularly Black Ghost of Empire. It's written for a broader audience. But then, of course, I'm looking, as I'm reading, I'm making notes of things I didn't know, people, places, historical events. Now I'm going to go look for stuff about them, and always read the footnotes. Always read. I'm surprised at the number of writers that I've been blessed to be in conversation with who were surprised I read the footnotes. Like, you read the footnotes? I said, but you put the footnotes in the book. I'm assuming you put them there because people want, but it's amazing how people read and don't read the footnotes. I mean,
that's how you could distinguish between a person that did research and a person that is spitballing. Um, well, an academic, because I'm not an academic writer, so I don't put footnotes. I will do cursory research, but I'm not doing any deep dives because most of the books that I've written are memoirs, right? So I collaborate with other people to tell their life stories. So footnotes are not necessary, but in books that like this, yeah, we need to know your source, and if you don't have a source, then the source is you.
But yours are there too. What you say? They're not written.
No, they're not. But
you can see the layers in which
yes, if you pick up a book, yes, you know that I've read some things.
No,
but it's not an academic, adventure as these books are. And I think it's important that we make those distinctions too as readers. I feel like a lot of us don't even know how to navigate these spaces because it's not even really taught, right? We get assigned a book list. You got to write a book report when you're in 5th grade or 6th grade or whatever. There's going to be a summer list that you read. But, even as you navigate in high school, different authors, it's not done in a way that to me sparks the imagination and the curiosity enough to go down these rabbit holes to learn more, right? Because you should be digging through like, oh, there's a name. I'm constantly, when you're talking writing, I want to know more. I'm going to do a cursory search. And then like you, if there's a book about it, and then we don't have time, right? We don't have time. But I think we need to make time to know. We need to make time.
We have to. We have to. If we don't, or we don't.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, now we are subject to other people telling us who our God is, how we should be moving politically, what we should be thinking about all things. and we end up with the ignorance that we're currently mired in. I feel like we're an ignorant quicksand vat, and it's taking us out. It's it's so frustrating. I'm watching. Okay, but we're here. All right.
No, you're watching. Wait. Go ahead, please.
I'm just watching all of the commentary, the see me, the desire to be heard, but without knowledge. A lot of people saying stuff, don't know what they're talking about. And clearly we're at a crossroad as human beings. The manufactured battles that we find ourselves in, that we welcome, because we ain't got nothing else going on in our lives. We're going to jump into some fight with people over what? Land, diaspora, where you from, your gender, right? What we doing, really?
What are we doing? Well, I mean, we're being driven. And actually, that's why I wanted to talk to Chris. He has a theme in this book. He calls it ghost lining. And it is the process by which victims of colonialism and victims of global level violence, like we are, there's a deliberate, always shifting effort to erase everything prior to our entry into this system as victims. So he says in property they have redlining. He says in memory they have ghost lining. In other words, everything before this moment is now ghostly. I mean, for example, given your extensive and prolific career as a writer, I was talking to my students in my hip hop class last week, and embarrassed that it took me until late March, because we are just now getting up into the moment of their living memory, to talk about some of these figures, and for me to say, well, my friend and colleague and comrade Karen Hunter was the writer of Kanye's mom's book. And they were like, oh, what? Yeah, I said LL Cool J. What? I mean, but I said, this is, and I told Chris yesterday, I said, this is an example of ghost lining. The generations don't know about the previous generations. And when I tell you that we were talking a couple of weeks ago about Rodney King rebellions, I had students in that class who were from California who couldn't even tell them who is Rodney King. Was he? I said, why did police stop him? I said, was he drunk? I know. And so, I mean, and so then I played Dr. Dre the day the N-words took over from the Chronic, and contrasted that with when NWA did Express Yourself, sampling the 103rd Street Watts band from the 60s. And Dre comes in and says, I don't smoke bud or cess because it give a brother brain damage. Of course, right in the wake of the Chronic, December 92, he releases the Chronic. But as I told him, in much of hip hop, even commercial hip hop by that time, you had to have at least one conscious track. And it was the day the N-words took over, and Dre sampled voices from the rebellion. And you hear these brothers saying, if you ain't down with the Africans in here, if you ain't down, then get out the way and let us blacks and let us Mexicans take over. I mean, and they were laughing. I said, blacks and Mexicans, these are brothers. The Crips and the Bloods call a truce. The Christian, in other words, but they were sitting there like this was ancient history. And the more we talked and connected it to Tamika Mallory, Until Freedom, the performance at the Grammys, they could then say, Dre and them now dancing in prison jumpsuits at the Super Bowl. That's the same. No, it's ghost lining. They ghost lining.
Right. Everybody going on national television, and we love her because I just feel like and said that she came up with Stay Woke.
Come on now.
And I was like, Dr. Carr just told us on Saturday that where it came from and how far it went back to.
Well, you had the conversation with our brother, Gullah Geechee. I mean, this is not come on now.
Yeah, but so what do we do? Right. And without denigrating, because folks getting their feelings real quick and then they take sides. Like your only side should be truth.
That's right.
That's the only thing you should have an allegiance to. And if it ain't truth, then back away from it. Don't sit in conflict over something that's not even true. Well, here we go. This is why we do this 160 episodes in a row now today, is to pour a clean glass of water and keep reminding people and erecting these ghosts. And
That's what
making sure
I mean.
people.
That's what we're doing. You know, it's as our brother who was sadly taken from us prematurely on April the 1st, and was ironically one day before his birthday on April the 2nd, Marvin Gaye. I'd say, you know, we ask about the events, we talk about it, and then we ask the important question: how have you been? I mean, you know, this is the human relationship. We, as Randall Robinson writes in Quitting America, you know, any society where you love things before you love people is not a society. And of course, as James Baldwin writes, and I was talking to Chris about this as well, because he quotes James Baldwin, but not this particular quote, but Baldwin said, you know, love helps you recognize what you don't remember. So of course we got all the room in the world for everybody. I mean, memory enhances our ability to do work. So if you were never introduced to it, you can't be penalized. It's not your fault. What kind of society creates this place where you wouldn't know that? So you know, and then the celebrity, we've talked about that, you know, how celebrity overwhelms, because, you know, I wouldn't assume that Erica Badu, who came out of South Dallas, who came out of the Performing Arts High School, I mean, you know, I know those Africans, Third Eye study group down there. I mean, talking about back in the day, and the sister who runs the bookstore in Dallas. I mean, you know, who's just listed in our compendium in narrative. I wouldn't assume she didn't know that she didn't create it, but you know, once those bright lights come on, you know, and every generation gets to recreate, you know. So
Well, I mean, but then that's our responsibility. Every time someone says, you know, the global majority, because they heard it from me, I always say I heard it from Frances Cress Welsing, who I'm sure it was in the ISIS papers, who I'm sure might have heard it from somebody else. But you know, you gotta start the lineage, right? You gotta pass the baton. You gotta go back and remind people. Karen Hunter didn't come up with the global majority. I'm not going to take credit for something that I read somewhere. I'm going to tell you where I got it from, and then you should go and read that, and then pull that thread. But to assume that you started anything in a world that is thousands of years with things that none of us could even imagine, from pyramids to obelisks to how do people create stuff with no technology? How in the hell do you think you started something? Discover something? I mean, it's just like, that's unfathomable. So I mean, the ego that it would require for you to think you created something. I was saying, there's two young ladies that solved Pythagorean's theory, two Black girls.
I read the
Yeah,
headline, but then I went on and read the article.
okay, so walk us through that, because
No, I mean, I just, listen. No, tell us, why are you smiling, Professor Hunter?
because even that, there's this desire to the media needs the fuel,
Right.
so you just keep putting the logs on without any actual study of what it is that you're actually putting out. And I'm sure they're brilliant Black girls. But
Absolutely.
to say a 2,000-year-old theory was solved by two teenagers, which is possible. Yeah, it's possible.
It's possible. But if I'm assuming, forgive me for making this assumption, but I'm assuming that 99.9% of the people who read the headline don't know enough trigonometry or maybe couldn't even spell Pythagoras. No, I'm just saying, I myself, I'm saying. So of course, I mean, okay, so help us, Prof, because again, you teach this. When you see a headline like that in the press, what should we be doing as readers once we see the headline?
You know what? I can't even direct you anymore, because it used to be.
No.
It used to be you could read the first two paragraphs of a news story, and get all of the facts that you need to then go do your research. The way you look at footnotes, that used to be the relationship.
You've made that point before.
Doesn't exist anymore. So you can read a whole story and still not know what the story is.
Wow. Okay, so what would you call that then?
Propaganda. I don't know what I would call it. I don't even know what to call it anymore, because propaganda is specific. I call it laziness. I call it editors that don't have any skills, right? Because my editor would say, well, okay, where did you get this? Give me more information. I've come back from a story many times that had, my editor challenged me and I didn't have an answer. And then if I didn't get contact information, we couldn't use that information, right? Did you call? Did you get the opposing view? No. Okay. Well, we can't run this. I'm imagining that back and forth doesn't happen anymore in a newsroom. I'm imagining there's not really any newsrooms anymore. What like where you have veteran editors that take this job so seriously. Everything's about getting to press first because now it's 24 hours. We had time, before the morning paper, before the evening, the first edition, to keep going back and getting more information until the sports final, which was the last paper that went out. But now it's like, look, we got to be first. And then it's like, okay, we may have a correction in because you can actually make corrections now in the content. But who's going back and doing that work to make sure it's right? Like I had a veteran journalist in my class yesterday, Marcus Barham, who did a book I'm sure you read on Gil Scott Heron that I'm sure you were like,
Yeah. Happy birthday, Gil. Today's
yeah.
birthday. Yeah, I'm
Why
looking.
did I do that? Why did that happen just now? That's so weird. All right, I didn't know that.
Pieces of a Man.
I did not know that. Yes, he
You
wrote
did.
that.
Yes, you did. You knew. You just didn't have it in the front of your mind. Clearly,
Yes.
you knew. Clearly, you knew. Piece of a Man. I'm looking at it right over there on my Gil list. Yeah.
So he came to speak to my class, and we had this back and forth because he's like, we used to be taught not to insert ourselves as journalists into the content, right? Into the story. Like we are literally the conveyors. We are the conduits to this information. But now you have to give your opinion. Like it's demand. Like every time I see me, and my in a story that's a news story, I'm sitting there like, what is happening? Like this shouldn't be, but we accept it, right? And because we want it now. We love the headlines, the clicks come in, we get algorithms. Now we can go sell ads. It's about the money that we, the people, are not served by this medium and this round the clock Trump stuff. Okay, man can still run for president, man, even if he's indicted, even if he can still run, he's still running, and if he wins, he can still win. Like, y'all, what are we doing? We round the clock.
I mean, I think it's very very, yeah. I mean, we obviously, the news broke on Thursday. Actually, Reese, I was with Reese, and
you were
rolling. Yeah, that's Thursday night is the night that we do, and it was Erica's last day. Erica Savage, she and Reese. Now you just building this beautiful community of these sisters, man. I love it. She gonna be hanging out with Reese on Saturday, so I'm like, this is beautiful. But I mean, we were there and the news broke, and I didn't.
People don't know what you're talking about. Reese Colbert has a live show on Saturdays on Sirius XM Urban View, and it's not just sisters, brothers, everybody.
Of course, everybody, for sure.
But I'm saying I need to say that because my job in this life is to provide platforms and voice, to give people who may not have voice, right? Because everybody's sitting, these gatekeepers, in judgment of like who they're going to pick. I don't do that. I'm like, who's got something to say? Go here. You got something to say here. And there's no judgment in terms of like, are you saying the things that that service us? But yes, that is actually something I do think about. When I say us, I'm thinking about us, not them. Does it service us? But also, are these people free? Like, if you want to, Reese free. Reese won't say what she got. I got to agree with it. I don't have to like the style of it, but that's the way diversity to me works. Like, you don't pick versions of yourself. You pick the people that reach the people, wherever the people are.
That's right.
So yes, Reese has a show Saturday. So after this, go listen to her. I think it's at 2 or 3 o'clock. On Sirius XM Urban View 126.
Oh, 126. Please listen to Reese Colbert. That's right. Oh, and Pan African Connection. Can count on the Nubians. That's the name of the bookstore in Dallas. Thank you. The Nubians have put it in the chat. That's right. And we got yes, and so and Randall Robinson makes this point as well in Quitting America when he talks about the importance of being small. He says, big probably not going to save the species, because this is a man spent his life jousting with states. In fact, he writes in his memoir about how the South Africans in the African National Congress flipped the script on him. And once they thought they could be in state to state relations with the United States, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But to the specifics of this Trump business and what we need to probably is take a deep breath and calm down with. What you are seeing and working every day to engender and foment the brick metaphor again is from the inside out, starting small. And as it grows strong. As you always remind us, those roots are sunk deep. We're living in a world now where those big forces, the forces that Chris Benjapur has been writing about and talking about, are on the brink of collapse. The United States of America, the criminal enterprise we call the United States of America, has always been on the brink of collapse. It has been held together by brute force, by violence. But it initially was stitched out of an idea, a brutal single set of violences, the ones that Chris writes about in Colonialism and Global Perspective. And of course, he isn't the first. I mean, there's so many who write, and we talked about that too. But the violence of war, the violence of settlement, the violence of creating labor to burnish that violence, that point of entry violence of war and colonialism and settlement, and then to stitch it all together using the water, port. That's how that modern world system is created. That's how colonialism should be seen in global perspective. Now, those violences hold you together. They fuel you being held together, but you have to be held together by concepts, by icons, shrines, totems, by common curated memories. Well, when you're talking about something like the United States of America, or when you're talking about other artificial kind of border created states, like almost all the countries in Africa, most of the countries in the world, in fact, you're talking about something that then has to it has to be maintained through a combination of force, interest, common interest, and if you're not careful, I'm sorry, I shouldn't even say that. Strike that. It's not a matter of being careful. If you're not utterly ruthless, then those things will take on lives of their own, because they are, after all artificial. They are markers for bringing people together for whatever purpose. Now, how does that connect with the conversation y'all were having yesterday about Gil and even the concept of how we read and know, and then this Trump business? Well, as I said, on Thursday, when the news broke, I'm sitting there with Reese Colbert and Erica Savage and Roland Martin, and Trump been indicted. Okay. No, the only thing I said, didn't say much that night. What I did say was that, as you said, Prof, he can still run for president, even if convicted. I would encourage people, although he was not president of the United States, he was attacked by the federal government consistently and imprisoned at one point, allegedly for sedition. We're talking about World War One. Look up Eugene V. Debs. Debs ran for president of the United States as a socialist, won millions of votes, and ran from prison himself. Trump can run from prison. Trump can be the president of the United States from prison. There's no provision in the Constitution that prohibits it. He meets the age requirement. He meets the natural citizen requirement. Okay. There's no requirement say you can't be a felon. You can't run from prison. Now, I don't know how you would have a chief of staff and have a staff running it from jail, but you ain't got to worry about this guy going to jail, maybe, because Alvin Bragg and them. I mean, once you indict somebody, now you get into the rest of the process, which may or may not involve a plea. And there are those who would say that this would, and I'm one of them, that this could burnish his bona fides, in fact, in running for president. It's very interesting. Today's New York Times, for example, I think as I leaf through this morning, and parenthetically, I drop a footnote here to say that I am well aware, obviously, of the 24-hour news cycle and how archaic it is to read a physical newspaper. But for me, reading the paper every day, in addition to being something my daddy did, which is why I do it, but so there's that connection with the ancestors, and there's one of the benefits of doing this is, maybe it wasn't the Times, maybe it was in fact maybe it was the Financial Times of London. I suppose the Times. But one of the benefits is that you get to read things in sequence, and you get to read things like a collage. So the reason that I'm looking through here one more time is because I recall the box, and there it is, the box. See, when you read on the internet, you're scrolling. It's a different process. You just kind of, but the serendipity, which isn't serendipity at all, Prof, you know this better than all of us, because having worked through, worked with, and taught how to do work in and around the press, including in newspapers and news magazines, this has been curated by somebody who wants to tell a story, by a bunch of somebody's, an editorial board, staff. So when you're reading the physical paper, you're seeing how people want you to think about things that have gone on in the world. So, of course, the front now, they're past this now. Trump gets ready for arraignment, so does New York. The white world, the business world, just got around to this. This is today's Financial Times. Trump set to face criminal charges in New York court. See, they had other things they needed to deal with, so they just getting around to making it the big headline, like we saw in, I guess it was, if I have it here, I'll pull it quickly. Yeah. This is yesterday's New York Times. Trump indicted. Okay, yeah. So as to say, Thursday night when the news broke, it was like, ha ha. I'm like, oh, everybody, calm down. This don't mean nothing. Now that doesn't get lost in the conversation, and increasingly that's going to be the conversation. But in the point of moment, we've been trained to like a Pavlovian response. Now, who hasn't said anything yet? Well, this is the big article on pages A16 and 17 as Trump prepares for arraignment, so does New York, continuing from page A1. But look at this little article here in the corner, in the bottom below the fold on page A17. Let's go to it very quickly.
And for those watching him, that's a broadsheet versus a tabloid.
Now, Prof, what does
that mean? Broadsheet is how a paper folds. So the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post are broadsheets. The Daily News, the Post, the New York Post are tabloids, and all of those British papers because of how it folds, how it folds. And so tabloids are more sensational because it's got that one giant, first page, and it opens that way. Whereas the broadsheets, it's so big that it's not, it doesn't lend itself to the giant picture, the big headline.
Now, is it apocryphal that the reason that the broadsheets are for the masses, the subway riders, the bus riders, so they can, or is that just like,
I think, as media, when they used to have the newsboys and the boys out, yelling and stuff, it's really about ease of, like, to your point, tabloids are more geared towards newly arrived immigrants for, first of all, the simplicity of language. They're usually written at a lower grade level, so that newly arrived immigrants, much like our education system, it's like,
right,
just to give you just enough so that you can go about your way and know some things. Whereas broadsheets are more investigative reporting. You have more, higher level journalism, so to speak. So the New York Times written on an 8th grade level, Daily News 3rd grade level.
Okay. Right. Which is, of course, increasingly the lines have been blurred because the point you're raising with the shift in technology.
Right. So how do we know?
How do we know, right? I mean, as you say, I mean, the wars of the 80s and 90s with the Daily News and the New York Post, we were talking about Yusef Hawkins and all of the bumpers and all. I mean, the war. In fact, Earl Graves made this point at Randall Robinson's retirement in 2002. They had the retirement here in D.C. And Earl Graves talks about the battles when he was in the street, and he was followed very quickly by Earl Lewis, the publisher of Essence, who was the chair of the board for Trans Africa at the time. And they were in the street fighting the police execution of Amadou Diallo He opened with that. And so those of us who are old enough remember the tabloid press, of course, and Donald Trump
Right.
with the Central Park Five. So yeah, the sensationalist headlines, the pictures.
Yeah, I mean, we had that conversation in my class yesterday because Yusef Salaam, I actually spent time with his
Yeah.
mom.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah, Sharon, I covered that, and I remember I was, in my early 20s, and the headline at the Daily News was "Wow, Wolf Pack" or something like that. And then I remember sitting at my desk looking at this full page ad that Donald Trump put in, calling for the death penalty. And I didn't have any of this knowledge that I have now, but my 20-something-year-old mind was saying, how do you call for the death penalty for people that have not even haven't gone to trial? There was no trial. And then it was a rape. It was a rape. Nobody died. Now you're calling for the death penalty, but it's that birth of a nation. Like, we got to protect white virtue. And at the time we didn't know who the lawyer was that was raped brutally, and it was a brutal attack. It was a brutal
Absolutely.
attack. Everything that points to it. But these children did not have an opportunity to even have a trial, and they were already convicted in my newspaper. And I sat there and I felt shame. And I remember feeling shame. And I remember spending those days with Sharon Salaam, who was devastated because she put so much into this boy who is now running for office. But I was saying to my students, Donald Trump spent more than a couple of $100,000 because he put ads in every newspaper.
Yeah.
With this long letter, full page. And now we find out those boys didn't do that. And I know at least one of them is not right to this day, because I spent time with him, and he will never be right again. I don't know what horrors he experienced as a 16-year-old behind bars, but he will never be right. And I'm not going to call his name. And
If you watch those documentaries, I think it's pretty clear. This man was traumatized. Yes.
And so Marcus Barron was talking about that too. He's like, everybody in New York was like, this clown could be, it was a joke when he ran, because we all know that he's a clown and he's not serious and he's all of that. But middle America, for them, and then I had to say this, for them, it was validation for their own mediocrity. Trump represents that, right? So I'm going to support him because he thinks like I do. Like, instead of the better angels, instead of us wanting elevation, it was comfort in the thing, the least common denominator, the lowest form.
That's right.
And and he said, I'm still shook that he got elected. I'm still shook by that, because we know.
Well, I mean, he got elected by a minority of voters and the non-voters. Congratulations, non-voters. You elected Donald Trump. Oh, yeah, you did. You didn't go out and stop him. That's why I got my little Dallas County Voters League hoodie on this morning, because we know there's an election on the 4th of April in Wisconsin. This Wisconsin Supreme Court. And if you are in the state of Wisconsin and registered to vote and have not yet voted in early voting, you need to handle your business, because you have an election between Janet, Prolasiewicz is running for. It's a non-partisan election for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, but she's running against a white nationalist named Daniel Kelly, a Trumper, an always Trumper, an election denier. And if Janet Prolasiewicz wins, that's probably the Wisconsin Supreme Court will revisit the ban on abortion, will revisit radical redistricting, all of those things. If Daniel Kelly wins, then you're looking at the possibility and probably the likelihood of this foolishness that is now before the Supreme Court out of North Carolina, the Moore case on the what they call the independent state judiciary, Moore versus Harper case. You're looking at the likelihood of white nationalist minority rule in Wisconsin and contributing to white nationalist minority rule in the federal legislature, United States Congress, and the Electoral College for the foreseeable future. Now, I don't give a damn about the framework that we call the United States of America. In fact, if there's a way to give less of a damn, that would probably be where I am. But let's be very clear. We're not talking about frameworks. We're talking about people. And so it's very important to understand that Donald Trump was not elected by the majority of people eligible to vote in the United States of America. Donald Trump was elected by a minority of the people who did vote and abetted by millions who did not vote. And so, yeah, it's a joke until the laughter stops and you find yourself in real peril, real peril. So, you know, again, thinking about this in terms of how Randall Robinson frames this in Quitting America, you got big and you got small. Small for Randall Robinson at that point, at age 60, when he went to St. Kitts with his wife, Hazel, his daughter, Kalia, and they relocated. Small meant St. Kitts, Hazel's place where she is from. Small then allowed him to think universally in terms of humanity, in terms of connections. But the first thing you got to do is shrink it down to think, shrink it down to listen, shrink it down to relationships and being. And then you can go back large because he had been large and been going large for a very long time. Donald Trump's a very small human being. But then again, all of us are really. But when you organize your logic, the way you move through the world around something as hate-filled, as violent, as anti-human as race, and by race I mean at the core whiteness, that's a small thing too. But it is a small thing that, having been cultivated through centuries of war, centuries of conquest and settlement, centuries of creating plantation and enforced labor, death camps and enslavement networks, and then centuries of ports, in other words, connecting. That small thing metastasized into a parasite that fed on humanity and created a system that now can't, that system it created can't be rehabilitated, can't be healed. It is a sick system from the inside out, and it must be destroyed. This is where Randall Robinson comes in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reason that I mentioned, as you talked about, talking about Trump and this indictment, like I said, on Thursday night, we were talking to say, man, just like you just said, it doesn't mean he can't run. It doesn't mean he can't win, be elected. Doesn't mean he can't serve, so to speak. Yeah, but just satisfying. Why is it satisfying? We need to think of with this with cool logic. And even since Thursday, if we listen, we see people now that logic is beginning to emerge, you see, because this isn't the Maury show, or maybe it is. This isn't Real Housewives of fill in the blank, or maybe it is. This isn't social media picking sides on something nobody knows anything about, or maybe it is. This isn't sports entertainment distraction where that too becomes a morality play. And we were talking before we went live, of course, said that Dawn Staley's not going to fight for the national championship with her young women, and nobody wants to see. I mean, there are millions who obviously want to see the little coach at Louisiana State University with her funeral home couture standing there, guiding young girls of African descent up and down the court versus the corn-fed cohort from Iowa. There are people who want to see that order has been restored in the white world, but this isn't that either. All that's entertainment. Ultimately, it's morality plays. We pick our sides. And so what this is real life. You see, as Black Dante, the mighty Most Def, might say, beef is not what Jay said to Nas. Beef is when the working folks can't find jobs. In other words, some beef is big, some beef is small, but what y'all call beef is not beef at all. Beef is real life happening every day, and it's realer than them rhymes that I gave to K Slay. In other words, we have to be focused, and we're seeing it now beginning to be focused on today's New York Times. Bottom page 817 is a little article. Some top Republicans are not speaking out. They can't condemn Trump. The pufferfish has already said that Florida will not cooperate in any attempt to extradite Donald Trump. The pufferfish, with 2 Ivy League degrees, including Harvard Law, knows damn well that no state can refuse and can withhold cooperation with the federal government when it comes to someone charged and indicted and charged. And you can't, Puff, you know that. You got a law degree from one of them Ivy League schools where they don't really teach you how to be a lawyer. We're going to come to that with Randall Robinson in a minute, too, because he went to Harvard Law, which should tell you the pedigree of people who go to Harvard Law. But at any rate, and he went from Virginia Union, and before that, Norfolk State. Behold the green and gold. Out of Richmond, Virginia, Randall Robinson, his brother Max, who preceded him at Virginia Union. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But Puff knows that you're just talking, but he also knows that most people don't know that. And so what he's engendering is a morality play, a distraction. So he jumped out there because he wants those millions of voters who are relying on those of us who won't vote and relying on the white nationalists who have seized control of too many legislatures in the United States and are on the verge of installing a white nationalist majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court so they can cement the white nationalist chicanery they've worked at over the last several decades in the state of Wisconsin. Puff knows that he is speaking to that white nationalist base, which is a minority in this country, but out of their smallness have the benefit of being at the center of a criminal enterprise called United States and ultimately the world system that, while it is fracturing, it's still very dangerous. Very dangerous. As you reminded us, Professor Hunter, a puffer fish is small, but it's poisonous. So he knows that. But let's look at the others who haven't said anything. This is Neil Vigner's article today. When Mitch McConnell, and by the way, we, mindful of the fact that John Fetterman has left the hospital and is going to spend another couple of weeks at home, very openly talking about his battle with depression. Mitch McConnell, who has not been in the Senate because of various injuries, has not been attacked. Why? Because the white nationalist press understand their Christian soldier leader, the cynic, as he has been called, because he don't believe in none of that. And the so-called mainstream press, the white stream press, seems ready to give McConnell a pass. When Mitch McConnell, the Senate's top Republican, voted to acquit former President Donald J. Trump during impeachment proceedings after the Capitol attack, he said in a Senate floor speech that former presidents were not immune from being held accountable by the criminal justice system and civil litigation. And now that the criminal justice system is taking Mr. Trump to task, shout out to Alvin Bragg, waiting on Fani Willis, waiting on several other prosecutors, albeit over a different matter entirely, Mr. McConnell has remained silent. Here are other high-profile Republicans who appear to be avoiding commenting on Mr. Trump's prosecution. Let's take just about maybe 2 minutes or less on this and see if we can see a pattern in the people who haven't said anything yet. Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota, Liz Cheney. A spokesman for Ms. Cheney said on Friday that she has no plans to comment at this time. Chris Christie, the former New Jersey governor, Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, and Larry Hogan, former governor of Maryland. Now, I'm reminded of the old Sesame Street song, one of these things just doesn't belong here, but maybe not. What do these 5 have in common? Anybody? Professor Hunter, what do you think? The governor of South Dakota, Liz Cheney, former governor of New Jersey, the governor of New Hampshire, and the former governor of Maryland.
Perhaps they want to run for president?
Well, I'll be damned. What you think, Prof? Come on back for a minute. Isn't that something? Now, if I was scrolling through the internet, I wouldn't have seen this story. This is just a little story in the corner of, as you say, this huge tab, both sides of this on page 8, 16, 17 of the New York Times. What you think about that? They haven't said anything.
So yesterday I had J.L. Colvin, whose daddy's Haitian.
Yes.
Who does probably one of the best impersonations of Donald Trump. So we did 5 minutes of Trump to kick off the show because it's Foolishness Friday. Those of you who aren't familiar with the Karen Show and you're just clip diving on YouTube, there's a whole, theme. You got to understand what it is. Don't just come on commenting if you ain't never listened to the radio show.
Come on.
So it's 3 hours, by the way. It's live. It's not a podcast. So I had him on early, to kick off the show. And he's a lawyer as well. And I had Sina Ghaznavi on, who's a lawyer. And we had a conversation about the politics of this. And he said, it was a time when, we have three branches of government, little civics lesson, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. The legislative branch makes up Congress, which is the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And he said, the House is every 2 years is, so they're constantly campaigning. But the Senate has a 6-year term. And that was done, the framers believed, so that people in Congress could focus on the future and sitting in what is needed in the future and not worry about votes right now. That's right. And that's why they have a 6-year term. It wasn't meant for people like Chuck Grassley and Dianne Feinstein to be there until they're 115 years old. It was meant because, for people to care about what is legislatively important, not now, not based on what the voters are talking about now, but in the future. And he said they are acting like representatives. Mitch McConnell's acting like a rep. And I never thought about it until yesterday. And I was like, everyone is like, almost like our media, algorithms and the clicks. That's and right. The click, they're going for the attention, and they're calculating that they want to be president of the United States without caring about what the country actually needs. We need someone to stand up and have some sort of moral fiber. One of my students who's not from here, she's from Jamaica. And she says, and I said, well, do you want to be a citizen? She's like, no. No, I do not, Professor. I'm going back home. But, and that's interesting too. But she's here getting an education. We can have that discussion. But she said, there was a time if someone stole a pencil, they would step down because stealing is wrong. And I'm not representing this country at the highest level as a thief.
Come on.
She said that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't understand why. There used to be integrity baked into these positions. Even Richard Nixon resigned, for crying out loud. Richard Nixon resigned. Like, that would never happen today. Richard Nixon would never resign today because the climate is such that I'm going to be quiet, even though I know it's wrong.
And because the Congress is not going to impeach me. He resigned because he knew that Congress was going to impeach him. If Nixon was here today, I ain't going nowhere. They already said they're not going to. That's right. So, and help me with this. Did you see? I just saw a trailer yesterday for is it called The Plumbers? It's like a limited series television. Yeah, if y'all seen it, maybe it's called The Plumbers. It's about G. Gordon Liddy. It's about, I think Woody Harrelson is in it again. Why they keep making these same
HBO? Yeah.
Is it called The Plumbers?
Yeah, The Plumbers. White House Plumbers.
Yeah, White House Plumbers. Okay. And I'm saying, okay, now Frank Willis died penniless. We talked about Frank Willis and Clay. We talked about him. Why do y'all keep want to rehabilitate these white boys? I mean, we know the answer. I mean, the only reason to keep doing this is that you want a gray area in this morality play called white supremacy.
Do you want to have this conversation? I mean, I know we were going somewhere.
No, we're good.
You got me reading so many books. I'm reading Ray Dalio. I'm reading this book called The Great Reset. And it was talking about, like all of these culture wars are manufactured because of the economy, right? So you had real men working steel mills, and they're in the coal mines, and they you bring home the bread and you win, and that's what a man is. And this Great Reset, the guy, there was a story the guy's sharing where this man was walking past this like beauty parlor with his son. And he said, your aunt was going to leave that to me, but because that wasn't a man's work, I didn't take it, right? He worked in a factory. He said, I liked coloring your mother's hair, and I liked cutting hair, and I liked doing all of that, but it wasn't manly. It wasn't man's work. And he said, I regret that, son, because I could have owned that building and had a business that I enjoyed doing, but instead I stayed in a factory where I never made enough money to actually, have a nice retirement. That said, I think about even this notion of, alpha male and, what it means to be. And Trump is the soft-handed, soft-bellied, never done a lick of hard work in his entire life, is the bastion of maleness because of how crass and crude and rude and brutal he is. And that is the symbol of manhood, right? But it's all manufactured so that your ass can be somewhere to do the work for the 1%, period. Right. And when Fred Hampton gave the message that, hey, you're just as victimized as we are, and people were like, yeah, you know what? He had to go. And when Martin got out there talking about the same thing. He had to go. And when Malcolm got out there talking about the same thing, he had to go.
Yeah.
And that is the message that they don't want, right? Which is this notion that if I can get you focused on your virility,
Right.
and your place in life, right? So you built this false narrative, and then other folk came here and were like, oh, we got to get 1,600 on SATs. This is all we need to do. And they actually followed your model, and you told the other people they didn't have to work.
Right.
And then they're looking around, they don't have any jobs now.
Right.
The job market is shifted. They're not coming back. You will never have those jobs. And now you're not ready.
Now
You're prepared for the world that is here, which is service oriented, right? Which is going to favor mostly women. So now you're seeing this other thing happening. Let's put them barefoot, pregnant, back in the kitchen. Let's do that because we can't compete because we don't want to actually do work. We like sitting on the veranda with our mint julep and having someone serve us. But in order to get there now, this is not the world. And now you got Africa saying, duck if you buck. Like, we ain't really impressed anymore because we got the resources, and the richest black folk in the world are in Africa. Like, and they got the most people under the age of 20. The future is not you. And you know that. So the fear of I can't compete, and I know it. The lie that I've been telling my children for the last several decades, the chickens have come home to roost, as Malcolm would say. And now here we are.
And here we are. And
so the only thing they can do is keep us fighting with each other. And if we fall for the okie doke, dummies, oh, you're African, you're from this, yes, do that, because I can't compete with you if you figure out that you actually have the power.
That's exactly
when the rabbit has the gun. The rabbit has the gun now.
Ain't no fun.
Stop it. Like,
ain't no fun. Well, the rabbit has
that. Sorry, I went off.
No. That is exactly what we're talking about today. I mean, in the previous generation, Herman and Noam Chomsky, when they wrote the book Manufacturing Consent, they said the reason that way you keep people down is you have to create necessary illusions. So we got the sports, we got the reality TV. Now, this is years before all this stuff, the reality TV, and you have to manufacture consent. So people will say, well, voting is a way to manufacture consent. No, if you're only voting and you're not running good candidates, for sure. And you can see that the way, and the way mass commercial entertainment media in collusion with this structure is able to shape opinion. It was very interesting. I'm sure you did comment on it too. See the long article on Hakeem Jeffries in the Times.
I did not.
It was
comment on it.
Wednesday. I thought it was fascinating because we've had that conversation here. I know longtime friends with Rosalind and Leonard Jeffries, both professors. Rosalind Jeffries, one of the finest art historians we have. Leonard Jeffries, longtime chair of African Studies at Black Studies, is called at City College. And I always wondered, at what point are they going to try to tie Hakeem to his uncle and auntie? The New York Times did a chef's kiss job of basically enveloping Hakeem and saying, no, he was a negotiator. Even when he was an undergrad, his uncle came to speak at his undergrad. He was between those who said free speech and those who felt offended by some of the things his uncle had said. I said, oh, they've decided. We make sure we put a firewall between you. You say you stay on your best behavior. You're not going to have to deal with a man who we literally tried to crucify. We fired him, took him to court. I said, they have decided, Hakeem, you pass for now. I mean, you can never be permanent. You know what I'm saying? Randall Robinson writes about that too. But it was fascinating to read this article. Because it's like, okay, this is it now,
Look at that. Because I'm thinking right now, Chicago. You brought up Wisconsin.
Oh my God, that's right.
I'm thinking Chicago.
Yes.
And I've had conversations with people from Chicago, and they don't have good choices.
No.
And I keep
asking, clear choices though. They're not good, but they're clear.
Who makes the choices? How do we get to these are our only choices? And I was like, so we just get Harold Washington and that's it? Like that. Y'all not so how did Harold Washington sneak in? Like
different times. And that's something that we want to talk about today too. I was looking at rewatching the retirement thing for Randall Robinson. This was 20 years ago. And something somebody told me many years ago about boards of trustees at HBCUs came back as I was watching Earl Graves, as I was watching Earl Lewis. Ed Lewis. Sorry, not Earl Lewis. Thank you, because Earl Lewis is actually an academic. Thank you, Ed Lewis, Earl Graves, Janetta Cole, Danny Glover. all these people who were involved with Trans Africa who were on the board. And somebody once said to me, said, once Black people got into positions of authority as trustees at HBCUs, because we were not initially for most of these places, many of those Black people had been institution builders. So if you go to North Carolina Central or A&T&M, if you're on the board, you might have been the head of North Carolina Mutual Insurance. You say, if you're, the founder of Essence Magazine, Black Enterprise, and this, but now what you have is Black people who work for white people. Is a different mentality. So what you see now is, so when you ask about Harold Washington is a coalition politician that comes out of organizing, that comes out of community, and the coalition that put Harold Washington in will be very difficult to recreate today. When you look at a guy like Johnson running for a mayor of Chicago now, coming out of the teachers union, that is an echo of the days when organized labor, because the only thing gonna beat capital is people. Somebody said that in the chat a minute ago. You can't beat money if you don't have no money. What you have is yourself. You know what I'm saying? So the unions have, Paul Vallis is an absolute creature and creation of Daily the Sun, of all them guys. I mean, after he leaves, here comes Arnie, Duncan. These guys are white machine guys. Johnson is an echo. He's not Harold Washington, but guess what? Nobody is. That generation, the Randall Robinsons, the Janetta Coles. I mean, these are some people who came out of segregation, Jim Crow. Interestingly enough, most of them born in the 40s. It's very interesting when I started looking, look at these. And I agree with Adolph Reed Jr. when he wrote his little book, The South, last year. And he said, that generation owes the future, owes us telling the stories. This is why Randall Robinson's memoir is so important. Because now with this ghost lining, young people have no idea. And they assume that when they see a Black face, it's the same as the Black face from 20 years ago, from 40 years ago, from 60. No, this structure works very hard to curate people. So why don't we have somebody like Harold Washington? Because that came out of a particular time and space that we can recover some of that memory, but it's going to come with a great effort because they flatten the distinctions between time. I mean, where are the journalists? Where are the great writers? You know what I'm saying? When you're coming along and you can think of, we were talking about this. I mean, you see Bill Rhoden at the New York Times, but what you don't see is Sam Lacey at the Afro American. That's who trained Bill Rhoden. The brother who was working for the NFL Network, Roland covered that. What's Thomas? I think his name. He was questioning Roger Goodell. Now they just got rid of him, and he said, "I went to Howard." That was Sam Yet. He said, "Sam Yet trained me." But see, that generation is gone. You are the Black press. This is where I'm going with. That's why I say it all fits together. When you go small, you're really setting it up to go global. So what you're doing now with these roots, and it's not a strategy thing. I ain't gonna say too much about it. What I'm saying is that, see, going small means you can't be stopped. It only looks like you could be stopped. I want to talk about this in terms of Randall Robinson. Yeah, Victoria. I think Brandon Johnson is. Thank you. Jim Trotter is his name. Jim Trotter. Thank you. They're putting it in the chat. Yeah, I listened to Brandon Johnson and am certainly attracted to a great deal of his vision. Paul Vallis is Paul Vallis. Okay, we talked about that actually. If you were in Nubia, we talked about this on Monday night during office hours when Dr. Delaney came in, Kim Delaney, who was a Chicagoan through and through. But that period, and Reverend Wright can talk about this as well, who also served on the board of Trans Africa, by the way, about those Chicago politics and the coalition politics that put Mayor Washington in. By the way, I should add this footnote very quickly on Randall Robinson. Got a text this morning from Reverend Wright, and he probably will put this in the chat as well if he's here this morning. Randall Robinson, he said Randall's funeral is Thursday in St. Kitts, and there will be a memorial service in D.C. at the end of May. Hazel and Kalia send their love. The family, of course, of Randall Robinson. So we know that ancestor will be initiated into eternity formally this week in St. Kitts. But the white nationalist violence that we're seeing around this country and the choices we have driven by finance, capital, and money, we are seeing something that may be on the verge now, maybe on the verge of collapse. And I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now, but this, looking back, when it does eventually dissolve, which is inevitable, all societies go through that, reconfigure, we'll probably look at this as an inflection point, and we won't look at 2023. We'll look at the last 50 years, and we'll see an acceleration of it. I mean, we saw what happened, news out of Mississippi this week here in the United States, rejecting Medicaid expansion. There are 9 other states, mostly in the old Confederacy, where they are simply saying we are willing to kill our voters in order to retain the ability to steal public dollars and channel them to our employers' finance capital. 3/4 of all rural hospital closures since 2010 are as a result of not extending or accepting Medicaid expansion. That's simply what it is. 3/4. So, those who get frustrated with these folk, because we too need health care. And we need health care in these states where our people by the millions live, not are trapped or live, because we have agency. Because many of the people who are suffering didn't vote. I am a unashamed, unabashed advocate for exercising the vote as a tool, not the tool, not the quote unquote silver bullet, the panacea, but a tool. Why the hell would you not use all your tools? Many people who are out here saying, voting is okay, you must have good health care. And don't bother arguing. If you don't, then we need to talk about the strategies. It's very important. Now, we saw that the governor of North Carolina signed into law Medicaid expansion this week. North Carolina became the 40th state. But that's because it's a Democratic governor, and they were able to ultimately bang on the legislature in North Carolina. And that isn't because the white nationalists in the Carolina legislature, of course, led by the same Moore, who is the Moore in Moore versus Harper, this independent state legislature cockamamie theory that they now have enough votes on the current United States Supreme Court to probably enshrine in law. Something tells me we're going to be talking about that shortly when that decision comes down. It's not because they wanted to do it. It's because this constant barrage, Moral Mondays. I was talking this week with Monifa Akinwole Bandele, who she and her husband Lumumba Bandele, long distance runners. Those of you from Brooklyn, y'all know the East. If you are from Mississippi and other places, the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Think about Baba A.K. Akinyele Umoja, who I talked about a little bit last week. Talking about them, she's the chief strategy officer for an organization called Moms United, which talks about everything from universal health care to maternal care to training more doulas and midwives, because that's an area that we need more people. In fact, there was a time, as Monifa was saying, that black women delivered all the damn babies in the country, white babies in the South and they babies white during enslavement. Come on, that's what we're talking about. Something. It's not like and before that, coming from Africa, of course, that's what we did. So it's not like we're coming into a new profession. This is what we did. It's what we do. But I'm saying all that to say that you've got people who are choosing their whiteness over their lives in this fracturing settler piece. And this is why all these politicians ain't saying nothing, because they want them people to vote for them if they run for president. Now, the pufferfish has to jump out there now because he hasn't announced yet, but as he's going around the country, he's realizing that his little pufferfish message not really translating in these places he's going. Doesn't mean he's out the game. Meanwhile, the man who has been indicted is rallying his neo-fascist, I'm sorry, they would call themselves white Christian nationalists, same thing, base, and saying, I'm being persecuted. Was Christ not crucified? I mean, I almost hear it, you know what I'm saying? So, this Trump indictment is important to mention as a symptom of a much larger malaise and not to dwell too much on it. And of course, when you start talking about spinning things, as we saw in my hometown of Nashville, the murders at the Christian school, which is about maybe 10 or 15 minutes from where I went to school, my public high school, Hillsborough High School. Everybody knows where that is in Green Hills if you're from Nashville. And this person went and shot up the school, killed 3 children, 3 adults, including a black man, the custodian in the building, one of the custodians in the building. And the Washington Post on Wednesday ran a feature-length article on the AR-15. The AR-15 thrives in times of tension and tragedy. This is how it came to dominate the marketplace and loom so large in the nation's psyche. The headline was "Revered and Reviled." See, this is a symptom. This is a symptom of, as Chris Manjapra is writing, war, settler colonialism, plantation and death camp labor, and then connecting it all through the ports. Not just the seaports now, but obviously the networks. So all of this going on, and Randall Robinson making transition a week ago, and Professor Hunter breaking the news here and making the very deliberate decision to do it to the nation. By the nation, I mean the Black nation, and not wait on white stream media to do it. And I loved the New York Times obituary because they finally got around to it, Prof, as you saw.
Took forever.
Took forever, right? And Reverend Smith was banging on them on Twitter. When you gonna do it? Washington Post and New York Times. But I understand why the great lady didn't want to do it, because Randall Robinson had a very clear relationship with them. He's above the fold on page 821 in Wednesday's newspaper. Randall Robinson, catalyst in fight against apartheid, dies at 81. That's right. Try to shrink him down. Watch this. I love this first. Randall Robinson, a self-described, quote, pained victim of stolen identity, end quote. So first thing you're going to do is try to frame him as crazy. Raised in segregated Virginia, who grew up to galvanize Americans against apartheid in South Africa and champion reparations for the descendants of slaves, died on Friday in Basseterre on the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, where he had lived in self-imposed exile. Again, crazy. You say exile. Self-imposed exile. Okay. Well, I guess you gotta say self. I guess I could understand it as a language choice. From the United States for more than 2 decades. He was 81. His wife, Hazel Ross Robinson, said he died in a hospital from aspiration pneumonia. This next line is what gets me. Born into poverty in a rat-infested home without central heating, a telephone or a television set, Mr. Robinson was raised by loving parents, both teachers. He went on to win a basketball scholarship to college and to graduate from Harvard Law School. In 1978, his older brother, Max Robinson, became the first Black person to co-anchor the news on a national network on ABC's World News Tonight. And then he goes on to talk about his things. We're going to talk about Randall Robinson for a few minutes this morning. But, rat-infested home. But his parents were loving. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. Cut loose the sandbag, but the balloon wouldn't go any higher. Let's go up to the mountains or down to the sea. You should always say thank you, but at least say please. Conjunction, what's your function? Hooking up, we're rat-infested, but loving parents. I get it. And you ain't got but a little bit of a word count, although Randall Robinson in the Black press should be on the front page of any remaining Black newspapers. And I must quote here Ron Daniels, who's one of the many people who wrote obituaries, and Kichi Taifa, who worked with Randall Robinson, so many others. I've been waiting, seeing them cascade. But the first news we heard here in Nubian Nation was from Karen Hunter, and I'm eternally grateful for that, because it's a where you were moment for us. Ron Daniels called Randall Robinson Black America's Secretary of State. Now, there have been a couple of Negro secretaries of state, right? Colin Powell was Secretary of State, wasn't he? Yeah, he's Secretary of the United States, not Secretary of Black people. And I would, friendly amendment to our elder, I would say he's one of the Secretary of States of the Black world, because Randall Robinson didn't see himself as a Black American only. In fact, when he moved to St. Kitts, when he moved to his wife Hazel's home, when they moved with their daughter Kalia, and as they were leaving, I think she was at National Cathedral School over there, and she had their daughter Kalia had done a project where they asked them to pick a piece of art, and she picked Norman Rockwell's painting of Ruby Bridges. Yes, that same Ruby Bridges that the white nationalists in Florida are moving to have neutered neutered. I want to use gendered language, spayed and neutered, de-racializing in terms of all the ways that you narrate Ruby Bridges' fight and her family's fight to integrate schools in Louisiana. Rosa Parks was told to move on a bus. She didn't, and she fought for herself. No, Rosa Parks was fighting white supremacists, but they try to, change all the language. But Kalia, as a young girl, picked this, and you think about the impact of curriculum. And she was in this white private school. Robinson writes in Defending the Spirit, his memoir, which we'll talk about more in a moment. He talks about how they would have loved to have sent her to a public school in DC, but the reality is that those public schools she wouldn't be able to get the kind of education that she would get at these other schools. And then in fact, I'll come back to that in a minute. I don't want to get too far down in that piece. But when Ron Daniels calls Randall Robinson Black America's Secretary of State, and I would go so far as to say, no, he's one of the global secretaries of state, maybe for the time of his most visible and engaged activity in Trans-Africa. He was the Black World's Secretary of State in some ways, not without difficulty and challenges, but it reminds us that we are in a society that is not a nation. It's not a nation, y'all. And when Robinson leaves, he says, I'm as much a Nigerian, I'm as much a Haitian as I am an African born into Jim Crow segregation in the United States. I'm an African. He says, my nation is my people. That's critical to understand about Randall Robinson. He comes from a generation that suffered American apartheid, whose parents had suffered it before them, whose parents had suffered it before them, whose parents had suffered the lash. But he is not foolish enough to commingle his beingness with the beingness of the criminal enterprise of war, of settler colonialism, of death camp labor, and of a network that binds it all together. He is not foolish enough to pick a flag and an artificial line over people. He is not a descendant of slaves. He is a descendant of captives. Captives who were not from the same places on a huge continent, the world's second largest landmass. However, who through force of resistance to those settler logics were able to create the possibility of a global nation in all of its glorious differences. Randall Robinson said, I am a member of a global nation. And I tried, as we talked about on Monday night in Nubia, if you were there with the several thousand at this point who are in our Monday night conversations, one among now the growing offerings across all 7 days in Nubia. But as we read and discussed in his book, Quitting America, the last page, he says, I tried to love America, its people, the dominant majority, their depiction of me, their treatment of mine. Because he talks about growing up in segregated Richmond, him and his brother Max, his father, who was the basketball coach, the all sports coach, because y'all know in Richmond, some of y'all in here right now from Richmond, so y'all know Maggie Lena Walker and you know Armstrong High School. Those were the rivals. And he talks about going with his father, Max Sr., and learning skills in the same coterie of young boys. His brother Max, 2 years older than him. And they were learning basketball skills, and they did with the Ashe family and Arthur Ashe Sr. And they didn't realize Arthur Jr. was around the corner on the other side of the building learning tennis. All these cats came together, but he talks about them going to the movies. And what they saw about Africa made them snicker and giggle. That foolishness stuff. Tarzan and all that. The propaganda, the war. We have overcome that to a degree. And I'm going to tie all this together in a moment. But When he says, I've tried to love America, its people, the dominant majority, their depiction of me, their treatment of mine, he's saying that I grew up in a society that taught me to hate myself. He talks about a beauty parlor in his memoir, Defending the Spirit. And he said, he is black owned, black people, he said, but at the same time, they're in there practicing pathology. Why? Putting the heat on their head to look like white people. He said, I myself did it. Smashing the pomade into my head and sleeping with the do-rags I have waves in order to go to church. Now, sure, that's a hairstyle. You can say that's a choice, but is it a choice when you've lived in a society that taught you that the hair you came out your mother's womb with and whatever variation it is somehow not the hair you should style? That the introduction of pomade isn't just a style choice, but it is something that has been inserted in your mind by looking at Tyrone Powers or Clark Gable during their period, or Brad Pitt in ours. The psychic war against Africans led Randall Robinson to live an early life where he says, I tried to love America, its people, the dominant majority, their depiction of me, their treatment of mine. I've tried to love America, but America, well, in fact, I should leave these eyelashes alone. But Professor Hunter, I caught by accident in the middle of the night a tweet that you let out. You said it was the eyelashes. Were you referring to the...
Oh, yeah. So yeah.
I'm just asking. I said, oh.
First of all, you have to know me before you comment.
Yes.
You have to know where my allegiance lie
No.
and why I am equal parts shady and loving, equal parts. But yeah, no, I just, it wasn't the eyelashes, of course. The eyelashes had nothing to do with the victory of Iowa last night. It was defense. It was that young lady that I think was evoking the memory of Steph Curry every time she released the ball.
Shout out. No question. They played well. They played hella game.
I was like, Lord have mercy. And it was nerve-wracking. But just about every one of those girls had those eyelashes. And I was just thinking about, and I get it. There's such commentary around the physicality of particularly women athletes and how they show up. And so what does it mean? We just talked about what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, and all of the characteristics that go with it. It was just me being snarky.
Okay. No, but I mean,
but to your point, yes, and no disrespect to those ladies, because how much I love respect Dawn Staley and the efforts that she put and what she represents. And I just was just an offhanded tweet that had no connection to anything. So y'all took it however you wanted. Maybe I wasn't talking about the game.
Okay. I just asked, no, but really, and no shade to any of them, right? Because, we both teach young people. And it's impossible, almost impossible, as a young person, unless you're just preternaturally mature, to see yourself in time and space. And there are things, even in your mid-30s, certainly by the time you get to be 40, 50 years old, you look back and say, but we all do it.
The most liberating thing is to show up in a world where you completely are comfortable in your skin. When we talk about freedom and Sonia Sanchez, the freedom that comes from your inside knowledge of self can only come with time put in on this earth and experiences. Live your life, make your mistakes, bump your lip, bust your lip, bump your knees, do all the things, and run headlong into adulthood and embracing every bit of who you are. But know who you are, every bit of it. And that's that can only come with time.
Yes.
Only come with time. Yeah. Yes.
Can only come with time. Somebody asked in the chat, would Brandon Nolan said, would Brandon Johnson be a better prospect if we knew he was granted an Africana framework? That's a hard question to ask. We can't. I mean, again, this is where we get into conversation. I mean, I'm tell you what framed it. This is what Prof and I were talking about last night for a minute. This question of loving a country. Can you love a country? Should you love a country? Should you love? And my answer is, of course not. But we'll get there. And again, Randall Robinson kind of evokes this. But
let me ask you. Do we need to love a country? Like what is our responsibility as citizens? Right? Do we need to love a country, or is the edict to love ourselves? Is the edict to love ourselves? And I'm not thinking individual, collectively. And if we love ourselves collectively, then the country functions the way it should, right? Is it love? I feel like we put a lot of stake in flags and ideology, and not a lot, to Randall Robinson's point, into humanity, into human beings.
That's
And if
right.
we centered humans, all humans, human beings who breathe the same air that you're breathing,
Yeah,
then this whole notion of patriotism takes, we should be patriotic to one another. We should,
that,
that should be our flag.
that's right. Well, of course, I think that the answer is of course. That's what we should be. We should be in community with each other. We should be thinking about that. In fact, one of the things that Chris Manjapra writes, if I can find it quickly in the book, he talks about this question of the 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 end of enslavement and the creation of emancipation was not the end of enslavement. It was the beginning of the next form of oppression. And as I mentioned with him yesterday, I said, yeah, when we read The Miseducation of the Negro in Nubia last year, when Carter Woodson calls Jim Crow, Jane Crow, apartheid in the US, the sequel to slavery, he's saying the same thing. Emancipation still reinforces the idea that there's someone else, some other system that has control over your humanity. I've emancipated you. What? Well, that means I had the power to emancipate you, and I continue to have the power to regulate you through laws, through policy. So the question of patriotism for Black people, for oppressed people, indigenous people, people who have been invaded, is really a question. Even white people who get pulled into the criminal enterprise and think that they have to somehow pick a flag and a country over humanity. This is a form for Black people anyway. And I say this all the time. I said this when Nicole Hannah-Jones, when she launched her Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard. And I said, when you see a lot of Black people waving that flag, that's cosplay. What they're basically saying is, please just leave me alone. I'm sure there are many people who didn't like that, but I feel like Randall Robinson. Plus, I done reread Randall Robinson. If there's a hell below, we all gonna go, but you can go first after you. So if you think I'm gonna take that back, and you see me with a flag, it's cosplay. I'm trying to get you to leave me alone. And so when you think about the questions that somebody just raised in Nubia about would Brandon Johnson be a better candidate if we knew he was African-centered, well, it would certainly send off alarm bells for people who pick their teams based on patriotism, because you can't be African-centered and be American. That's impossible. And now you can wear some kente cloth. You can put a black fist up every once in a while. You can shed a tear at Cape Coast like the Vice President of the United States did. And I have no doubt in my mind that when Kamala Harris stood at that podium, it says Vice President of the United States, and many of us, we've all been, Prof, that they're in that crashing surf with the cannons and the Atlantic Ocean beyond them at her back this week, and began her remarks at Cape Coast, unscripted remarks, at least as has been reported. And I tell you, whether the rest of her remarks were scripted or not, or whether she departed or not, I tell you what wasn't scripted. When she opened her mouth and you heard that catch in her voice. If you got any African blood, you can't stand in Elmina. You can't stand at Cape Coast or Fort Jesus and Mombasa. You can't stand on Goree Island. You can't stand in Cameroon. You cannot stand in Ouida. You cannot go anywhere. You can't go to Angola. You can't stand anywhere where they snatched our ancestors out. You can't stand anywhere and not feel that. Now, I don't know relationship between she and her husband. I assume they love each other, but I know it's got to be a weird feeling to walk into that dungeon with a white man.
Let me tell you, when I went, they had some of these folk, and I refused to go in, and I told them I will not share this experience. I will not share this experience with them. I will not share this experience with them. I'll either wait or they're going to have to wait, but I will not go in to this with folk.
Do it. Can't do it. Can't do it. Can't
So
do it.
I saw that picture, them holding hands, and I was like, that's weird to me.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe not to her, right? I mean, but
No, again, love is love. That's all good. But there's a particular spirit in those places.
Hmm.
There's almost, and I guess it's like, Daniel Black's The Coming, it's like that boy coming down into the holds of the ship. But when I asked him about, why you brought humanity to that colonizer, because he said to show the evolution that years from now, that same young man will have lost all sense of himself and would be probably the captain of the ship.
Will be the captain of the ship. And maybe there'll be a couple of pet Negroes he'll keep around, but he gonna maintain his system. But and yeah, we respect that. Yeah, you can't say you don't respect it if you are serious about the idea of our common humanity. So respect everybody's humanity. But when I go back, the first time I went, we were all black people. Leonard Jeffries was there. Leonard and Ross Jeffries were there in '96. And it's one thing to be in Black Star Square, Kwame Nkrumah, where he spoke. And of course the Black Star in the center of Ghana's flag, taken from that global Pan-African movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World that we've talked about many times, of course, Marcus and Amy Garvey. And Kwame Nkrumah, heavily influenced as a Pan-Africanist, telling everybody to come home. It's one thing for Kwame Nkrumah, you stand in Black Star Square, where Nkrumah invited everyone to celebrate the independence of Ghana in 1957. And the president of Howard University was there, along with Louis Armstrong and Martin and Coretta King. It's one thing to stand there in March 2023, and to go to a state dinner with the president of Ghana, and you've brought along the presidents of Clark and Lane University, Howard University, and Morgan State University. And people are like, this is great. Yes, it's one thing. But Randall Robinson writes about what is the responsibility of elites. It's one thing to do that. It's quite another thing, though, to go into that dungeon. And on the day before Marvin Gaye's birthday, it reminds me of his song Trouble Man. Because when you go into a space like that with that many ancestors that have been in that void that Chris Manjapra is writing about, that becomes the connecting piece, that darkness. What does Marvin Gaye say in Trouble Man? I know some places and I've seen some faces. I got good connections. They take my directions. When people say that's okay, they don't bother me. No, I'm ready to make it. Don't care about the weather. Don't care about no trouble. Got myself together. I feel the kind of protection that's all around me. I come up hard. Yeah. I've been for real, baby, with the trouble man. There's only three things for sure: taxes, death, and trouble. Yes, indeed. I feel the kind of protection that's all around me. You come in that room holding the hand of a white man, if you can feel that protection all around you, God bless you. Your common humanity is stronger than mine. Because like Randall Robinson, I've seen too much. I love you, but I can't hold your hand walking in here. Because somebody look like you raped countless people that look like me going up them back stairs in the women's side of this dungeon, sir. So we'll continue to hold hands on the other side. In fact, I really need to go in here first. But I get it. I get it, because Kamala Harris, in the moment she stepped at that podium, that Africa came up through her voice. And then she continued remarks. And what increasingly grew stronger was the state, because she is the vice president of the United States of America, not the vice president of black people. Colin Powell was the Secretary of State of the United States of America, not like Randall Robinson, the Secretary of State of black people. And so when Randall Robinson talks about this, what Chris Manjapra and I were talking about is what Randall Robinson is talking about. He's talking about living our full humanity in a society that forces us to negotiate with this system. And ultimately, in order to destroy it, we've got to figure out ways to do inside and outside. And that's really the life of Randall Robinson. That's what I'm going to spend the last few minutes today. Manjapra writes about this system wanting to extract from us this hopeful suspension of final judgments. What is a hopeful suspension of a final judgment? Meaning what? We know we've abused you. We know we've done all this to you. But ultimately, we want you to suspend final judgment, because we know that ultimately you can, we're going to be better. Just keep trusting us. as we said in class, year 4 last, just hang with us. Go to hell. While I was looking for Randall Robinson's first novel, which I have around here somewhere, The Emancipation of what's his brother's name? Clay. Somebody will look it up. I got it around here somewhere. I got a signed copy. I just couldn't find it. But anyway, the other ones I have here, I'll mention them in a minute. I did come across this book I've mentioned before. This is JFK Ordeal in Africa. He's on the phone there after having learned on the 13th of February 1961 that Patrice Lumumba has been killed. Yeah, he ain't sad. He just like, oh shit, now I hope the rest of these Negroes don't kill the rest of us. But the book opens with a real war criminal. At least he's been called a war criminal for most of his adult life, certainly over the last 50 years. Never tried, never convicted, of course. And that would be a man who still walks the earth some kind of way, Henry Kissinger, who Randall Robinson talks about having real battles with, because, of course, Kissinger with Nixon and Kissinger from then on supporting apartheid governments, the governments that Randall Robinson was fighting, the governments that Trans-Africa was fighting, the governments that Ron Dellums was fighting in the United States Congress, that Charles Diggs was fighting in the United States Congress, the governments that were being propped up here, along with other dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo, then known as Zaire, coming as a consequence of the United States and France and Belgium's interference in the politics of the Congo in the 1960s. But there's a quote from Henry Kissinger here at the beginning of this book, JFK Ordeal in Africa. It says, the conjectural element of foreign policy, the need to gear actions to an assessment that cannot be proved true when it is made, is never more crucial than in a revolutionary period. Then the old order is obviously disintegrating, while the shape of its replacement is highly uncertain. Everything depends, therefore, on some conception of the future. Now, what is this white nationalist criminal talking about? He's saying that as structures change, as social structures change, if you are the one who built the existing social relations and social formations, the ones that Chris Manjapra is writing about in Colonialism and Global Perspective, if you want to maintain your control, you better have a vision of how you're going to maintain control. This is about the future, because you're in an unstable moment. We are in another unstable moment in global history. I was just reading, and I know I put that somewhere else. There's a new book, relatively new book, new to me anyway, on Asian relations in the 14th century to now. China, Korea, Japan. And how the concept of the state that we live under now, the so-called nation state, was not something that they developed their societies around. So when you look at China as a country now, North and South Korea, which didn't exist until after World War II during the so-called Cold War, and Japan, you're not looking at countries in the way that we would look at the United States, for example, or even England, for example. But you're looking at now in a world system, obviously they got labels and lines, but the world that is coming is going to be increasingly driven by those who see themselves as connected beyond national boundaries, beyond state boundaries, as we talked about in our Introduction to Africana States class in framing question 3. How did Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? And this is something Chris Manjapra is writing about in Black Ghost of Empire, because he talks about this process of rememory, like Toni Morrison talks about, this process of remembering, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, talks about. And Randall Robinson understood that while he was born in the United States, and this is what we're going to talk about him in a minute, for a few minutes. While he was born in the United States, his allegiance is to people, to his family, to his community. And there are moments, as Chris says, when the system that exists wants to elicit, extract, demand of, elicit from, extract from those it oppresses some hopeful suspension of final judgment. Hang with us. Well, Randall Robinson says, I finally woke up, which is why he says at the last pages of Quitting America, as we know from Monday night, and as the rest of the world is finding out now as we read through this, He says very quickly, I tried to love America. Its people, the dominant majority, their depiction of me, their treatment of me. I tried to love America, but America would not love the ancient, full African whole of me. Pause. What is an ancient, full African whole? Africa was not one place. No, it wasn't. But the pressure cooker of the modern world system created the possibility of Africa as a concept that we could all buy into. African humanity. It's very important. Thinking about how Randall Robinson grew to think of the world, we understand that the Africa we're talking about now didn't exist back then, but there is an African personhood that transcends all this time and space that we brought with us after developing, first of all of humanity and creating in our African humanity distinct ways of knowing, distinct forms of culture, meaning making, distinct movement and memory, and then having that stuff pressure cooked across waters, Indian Ocean, Red Sea, Atlantic Ocean, creating a global Africana, or at least the possibility of it. So if you want me to suspend something and think about a future, it's going to be that. It's not going to be becoming a pair of damn earrings or a bracelet or a beautiful cap or perhaps a nice shawl on your funky ass white nationalist global enterprise. Not gonna do it. And any Negro that picks that, go with God. But understand your master is teetering now. And so Randall Robinson goes on to say, again, I've tried to love America, but America would not love the ancient, full African whole of me. Thus, Robinson writes, I could not love America. I had come to know too much of her work. I think this is something that is particularly symptomatic, and everybody in here, we're a global family now. If you got people in your family, elders who grew up under the hard, brute, open force of white nationalism in the world, I know all our folks are here right now. I saw Aya in the chat. So Aya and Adesoje and Baba Oz and all them. I mean, you know, your parents and great and grandparents and great, they remember the British in Nigeria. They remember the British and the French in Cameroon and the Germans. They remember the Italians in Somalia and in Ethiopia. You remember, if you are South African, you got elders who remember the Afrikaners in their full-throated bleats. You remember Namibia. You remember in Zambia how they operated. We're going to talk about Zambia in a minute with regard to Kamala Harris's grandfather. I mentioned him in passing, PV Gapalan. In fact, I might as well mention it now very quickly as a footnote. You know, she went to see the place where she was 4 or 5 years old. She and her sister, a couple of years older, her Maya, where they spent time visiting their grandfather. Their mother made sure that they went back to India, but they went and saw him in Zambia one time, in Lusaka. The Zambian government was scrambling apparently over last week, couple of weeks, to find the place where he was stationed because he had been sent there by the Indian government. In fact, I was laughing. I say, here come Kamala Harris. She is literally the Afro-Asian. They had that Bandung conference in 1955, the Afro-Asian conference. 9 years later, the Afro-Asian is born that becomes the vice president of the United States. She visited her grandfather, who was sent there to help the first president of Zambia, KK, as they called him, Kenneth Kaunda. And I will say very proud that I got a chance to spend a little time with Kenneth Kaunda one time in South Africa. We're at the Steve Biko conference. And, you know, President Kaunda there, he's from that generation with Julian Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah and them, even Patrice Lumumba. And she was in Zambia at the place where she met her grandfather, went to visit her grandfather when she's 4 or 5 years old. Now, why is he there? He's there sent by India to help Zambia because Zambia is dealing with this influx of immigrants. Where are they coming from? They're coming from what used to be known as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Because Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, because despite the best efforts of this funky ass Henry Kissinger, who still somehow walks the earth, and Richard Nixon and their friends in England and you know, the Lancaster House agreements, because of that, despite their best attempts to keep propping up the state at the tip of South Africa, Zim would be free. And in 1980, they took their freedom. So now here's an influx of immigrants into Zambia fleeing. Why are they fleeing? Are these black immigrants? Are they white immigrants trying to maintain their power? What's going on here? But PV Gopalin is sent to help the Zambian government with these immigrants that are coming. Why? Because you know one thing about white supremacy, they're gonna run their criminal enterprise. If you're a guy like Elon Musk and you come out of your mama's womb in South Africa, you're gonna be global. By the way, I saw in Financial Times that the Teslas are not holding their resale value. Apparently, it's plummeting. Anyway, we wish you our coldest regards, as Gil Scott Heron might say, and dot dot did it dot dot dash the ghetto code. Y'all know about that. Go look up Gil Scott Heron on his birthday. He said of Frank Rizzo, we understand he's sick. We wish you our coldest regards. We understand that Elon Musk is losing even more money. We wish you our coldest regards in terms of your product. I know you ain't own the Teslas, but the resale value going down. Maybe to make people think twice. But my point is that you were born in South Africa, but you can live in London, Madrid, Paris, New York, and because white supremacy is global. Now the question is, can we make Africanity global in a way that benefits us? So yes, in 1980, Zim takes its independence. Randall Robinson is sitting there in the stadium as the British Union Jack goes down and the flag of Zimbabwe goes up. And he says, I was there with a sister from South Africa, an elder who was saying, I hope I will live long enough to see this day in my country. And he said, you will. Black People's Secretary of State said to that elder, you will. And she did. He writes about that in Defending the Spirit. Now, Kamala Harris at 4 or 5 years old, she's in Zambia visiting her grandfather because there is an attempt to create some solidarity and maybe some connection. And here she is as a grown woman standing in that same Zambia representing Black America and Jamaica and India as she travels the world as the vice president of these oppressed people. Oh, wait, no, she's the vice president of the United States of America. So no shade at her at all when she gets at the podium in Lusaka a couple of days ago and says, I'm here to foster a new relationship with Africa and in Zambia. That means what we can do as the United States to foster private investment and public investment. Well, that private investment started when they put all them African leaders on a plane and brought them to Washington, D.C. back this summer. And y'all remember we talked about that. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State for the United States of America, is standing over the shoulder as the president of Zambia is signing contracts with businesses, U.S. businesses that want what Zambia has. And what does Zambia have? As a 4 or 5 year old, Kamala Harris said, when I was visiting my grandfather, she writes about this in her book. She says, when I was visiting my grandpa, one of the things I remember, I don't remember much, but one of the things I do remember is how red the soil was. You know why it's red? Because Zambia is Africa's leading producer of copper. So as a little girl, I remember the red dirt. As a grown-ass woman, I'm over here to make sure these Zambian markets start giving this damn copper to our people. Black people? No, the United States businesses. Come on now. This is a global game we're playing. Meanwhile, China, as we talked about the other day, what was it, $22 billion I think they owe China? And have defaulted Zambia on the loan. That gives the United States a point of entry, not the United States government, but the United States business. Why? Because China and their Belt and Road Initiative has been in, and we've been talking about that a lot. The businesses that China is doing. So you see that they have spent about $240 billion in 22 countries in the last 20 years. Many of those countries are defaulting. China, however, is not in multilateral talks. Meaning what? They're not bringing in the International the International Money Fund, or the World Bank. See, these institutions, these Bretton Woods institutions were created after World War II because Europe, battling between the Churchill version of let's keep the empire going, chin up, fight on, and America like, nah, we need to have soft power. Meaning what? We're going to stay in charge, but we're going to make it look like we're your friend. Even as we take out people who might not, agree with us. Again, White Malice, Susan Williams' book, we talked about that. Osmond talked about that as well. This process, however, China now saying we'll float the loans, we'll float the finance. Now, the problem is Chinese loans come maybe 4 or 5% interest. The IMF loans come at maybe 2% interest. The countries, the so-called underdeveloped countries, many of them in Africa, are faced with a Hobson's choice, which is no choice at all. So the vice president of the United States is over there looking for points of entry for the United States to get stronger in a continent, which is indeed the future. And as Henry Kissinger said, you got to have some kind of theory of the future when you're in moments of transition, which is why, as you say, Professor Hunter, President Addo in Ghana is saying, yeah, we open to everybody. And y'all, you made that point on the radio. Yeah, we open to everybody. We open there. But are you open to everybody? Because Zambia then defaulted on the money they owe the Chinese. In East Africa, you got some problems going on with that. In Sri Lanka, they owe the Chinese money. They just got money from the IMF, and the Chinese are like, "Are you going to take a loan from the IMF? Maybe we don't refinance your loan." So now they putting pressure on the Chinese. Well, you got to restructure our debt. And the Chinese is like, "Yeah, but you took money from the IMF, and we don't do multilateral, meaning multi-institutional financing. You took money from us for Belt and Road. What you gonna do?" So now you got a problem. Guess who's looking at that? Those other 20 countries. Who are those other countries that have taken money from China? Well, Pakistan. I mentioned Zambia. Who else is on that? Oh yeah, Ghana. Come on now. Now we were talking, and several people said to me when the vice president of the United States was meeting with the president of Tanzania, President Hassan, that how are the Tanzanians looking at her? Or are they looking at her like, rah, rah, black people, like we in Black America, who incredibly naive when it comes to foreign policy? In fact, one of the things Randall Robinson said, "I'm very sad because Americans generally, and Black Americans specifically, which breaks my heart, know very little of anything west of Los Angeles and east of New York." Meaning what? We don't know. Maybe we could also say north of Buffalo and south of Dallas, or south of Houston. In other words, when you go outside the United States, first of all, we don't know much inside the United States, those of us who are in the United States, but outside the United States, we don't know. Oh, the president, vice president of the United States, look how them black people should with it. Idris Elba, that's great. He's from Sierra Leone. He up in the studio. There's Shirley Ralph. That's beautiful. It's all beautiful. That's great. Now, how do it free us? Because one of the things Randall Robinson says, I see how those kind of things free the elites. Now, the question is, how do it free the rest of us? Because in Ghana, they are organizing and saying that this government is not doing what we need as the people. Part of it is because you take in outside aid. You don't want aid, you want trade. But you can't get trade, because if you get trade, that means you can stand up on your own 2 feet, and the United States don't want that. The vice president said, we want partnership. We don't give aid to Africa. When we partner, yeah, we know how your partnership work, Madam Vice President, against even the argument you might make behind closed doors. But you're not the vice president of black people, of Indians or Jamaican. You are the vice president of the United States. It's an elective office that's more caretaker than it is policy driver. Who's driving the policy is the people that paid for your seat. They paid for the mummy seat. The guy who might drop you from the ticket or might not, because he got to whip up electoral fervor in a year. And to do that for black people, maybe you just got to put a black face out there. Let's bring this all together in terms of Randall Robinson. When you start with a network, you can grow. But that network got to be based on something. It could be based on family or blood. By the way, I don't know if y'all saw, I was in the Financial Times the other day. First Citizens Bank out of North Carolina. It's a family-owned bank, started with one branch in the sticks of North Carolina, in the country. They in Raleigh. Some of y'all know First Citizens. I'm looking to chat in a minute and see if somebody know First Citizens. You know what they did on Sunday, a week ago tomorrow? They bought the rest of SVB in an auction. Yeah, they bought Silicon Valley Bank, the rest of it, in an auction by the FDIC. Over the last 20 years, First Citizens has bought about over a dozen banks that the FDIC sold to them in auctions. They've now jumped to the 16th largest bank in the country. They're almost all in small towns. 70% of their deposits are from people who are FDI insured, meaning less than $250,000. Y'all better look at who's right. One of the guys in the family, it's a family-owned bank. One of the people in the family was a congressman, Republican congressman out of North Carolina. How much you want to bet they paid some money to help Moore versus Harper, the independent state legislature? See, while we talking about, games and reality TV, they talking about how we gonna keep this criminal enterprise going. Now, I'm not saying, of course, First Citizens is a criminal enterprise. I'm just saying that capitalism is very key to this, and capitalism doesn't know any state boundaries. Capital flows internationally. And then when we come up and say, let's connect internationally, their response is, you better go salute that flag and get in them lines, because we set this whole thing up for you to stay separate from each other. Randall Robinson busted that out from the inside. So let's talk about that. I wanted to mention that because, we have expectations of politicians that we shouldn't have. You know, the vice president, God bless her, is the vice president of the United States. The president of the United States, Barack Obama, was the president of the United States, not the president of black people. Now, can we press them to do stuff? Yes. Should we expect that they'll respond quicker than, say, a Bill Clinton, who ain't said nothing about Randall Robinson that I saw, which he probably shouldn't, because Randall Robinson might get up out of wherever they have his body and go slap Bill Clinton based on what we're going to talk about now. Their relationship, particularly because Randall Robinson was very clear that Bill Clinton sold out the Caribbean, beginning with Haiti. But he just followed in a long line of politicians who've sold out the Caribbean because, you know, in fact, he talked about the Mickey Cantor, the U.S. Trade Representative. Robinson is sitting there meeting with him. He writes about it in Defending the Spirit. And he talks about how he's saying, look, the Jamaicans just want to sell their fruit. They just need trade. And Haiti the same way. All I need is trade. And Cantor's like, oh, yeah, we're going to make that happen. We're really about trade. Then he says he sees this white boy meeting with Chiquita Banana CEO, which used to be United Fruit Company. We talked about that when we talked about Costa Rica and the Garvey movement last summer. But the whole point is that this is where the phrase Banana Republic comes from. We ain't about to let them sell them bananas. You know why? Because they're saying they come to Robinson like, how do we deal with this question of the war on drugs? Robinson is like, they're only selling drugs because they can't sell their fruit. Michael Manley is my friend, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. In fact, Randall Robinson talks about that. Michael Manley's his friend. And Michael Manley, who they call a communist and a Marxist, Robinson says, I'm not sure any of them communists or Marxists. Not really, not Lumumba, not Manley. Man, y'all took out Maurice Bishop. Michael Manley tells me in Grenada. And Maurice Bishop was friends with Randall Robinson. Again, this guy is like the Black World Secretary of State. He's dealing with black people. Manley is like, yeah, man, these guys are not interested in anything other than power. You have to talk to them because it's a structure we live in, but always be clear about what is going on. And when it's clear that that part of this drug issue is because, like everywhere else, including here in the United States, what did Gil Scott Heron say? He said, you know, the lady was looking at some hungry babies and decisions had to be made. In other words, I got to feed y'all one way or the other. Happy birthday, Gil Scott Heron. Randall Robinson is confronting what we call realpolitik. He's talking to the U.S. Trade Representative about trade with the Caribbean, and the trade representative is lying to his face saying, oh, yeah, we're for trade. No, what you for is the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Banana, and damn them Jamaicans, damn them Haitians, and they will sell drugs. And we ain't really trying to give no money anyway to crack down on drugs. We'll wait till they get here and lock them up and then pay ourselves to guard them and feed them and clothe them. Criminals, funky criminals. So if you're going to be a politician on the inside, you got to fight that. But we have to be on the outside, making sure that you have no choice but to change. And this is the power of Trans Africa. Now, let's spend this last couple of minutes here on Randall Robinson. Defending the Spirit. This is a book, and we were talking in office hours on Monday night about reading a book. And I was thinking, we could read Defending the Spirit. Defending the Spirit, published in 1998. Very important book. If we chose something from Randall Robinson, we could choose Quitting America, which we read from. This is from 2004. We could choose, and I'm sure y'all put it in the chat by now. I just haven't had a chance to glance. We could choose his book on Haiti, where he goes through all of this. The kidnapping of Aristide, the two coups, an unbroken agony, how the New York Times sent their reporter down there, Lydia Paul Green. They lying to everybody. He said, I'm at the elections, and the New York Times reporters are saying there's all this violence and stuff. I'm walking around. I'm with the people. I'm saying, we don't see this. I'm looking at international observers. I'm looking at the UN, which is very problematic in many ways. We know that in Haiti, and Randall Robinson doesn't shy away from that. But at the same time, he's saying, then I pick up the New York Times, and they're saying all this violence and nobody's voting. That's a lie. So I know why the New York Times waited, because y'all not Randall Robinson's friend, but he knew that and didn't give a damn. We could read, of course, The Debt, his best known book, The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. And then a couple of years later, he wrote The Reckoning, What Blacks Owe Each Other. Or we could do his final book, which is a beautiful book about a grandmother, a grandson, and ancient Africa, Ethiopia specifically. The grandmother and grandson are in Virginia. It's kind of like what Du Bois does. He sees some autobiography in it. The grandmother had been blind since birth, but when she dreams in vivid color. The book opens with her as a princess and her sister, who's also a princess, and they're watching the dedication at Lalibela of the stone churches of Ethiopia. They back in like the 11th century, the 12th century, and she's dreaming, and then she hears the. In fact, let me just do this right quick. Give me 30 seconds here, because it's a beautiful thing. She says, let's see, they're watching this dedication. And then as Maron was speaking, one of the princesses, the other princess, the princess felt in her ears a pulsating rush of blood and heard an unfamiliar interior voice that was not her own. The voice seemed to be coming from far away and inside her head at the same time. The princess made an effort to ignore the voice and tried to push it away from her. But the voice came again, this time more insistent. It frightened the princess, not least because the one word the voice had sounded inside her head and in the back of her mind was not of her language, Amharic, although he also talks about Ge'ez, the ancient language. America's not going to celebrate the full, whole African self of us. But of a strange language she'd never heard before and could not understand. Where, Maron? But the voice inside her head had by now gained purchase. With a small, soiling undertow of an unwelcome memory, the little voice spoke again. Let me pause here. The beauty of language. Randall Robinson writes, with the small, soiling undertow of an unwelcome memory, the little voice spoke again, childlike, lovingly. The princess had been happy on that Fasika morning, even as something warned her that she oughtn't have been. Something in the back of her mind kept pushing itself into her thoughts. Then she heard the strange foreign word again. The word seemed to have been spoken by a child, a boy child. Grandma. Her eyes came open, fully open, but she could no longer see the Abyssinian mountain that the Sabbath sun had turned red like fire. She could no longer see the calm waters of the River Jordan, or the church faithful in their ceremonial finery, or the magnificent stone worship houses her people had carved from solid rock. She could no longer see anything. She was blind. For a long and disconcerting moment, she did not know who she was or where she was. Only 5 to 8 seconds later did she realize that she had been dreaming. That's the grandmother in Virginia, ain't never been outside of Virginia, spent her whole life washing clothes at a white folks' house, talking to her grandson in the novel published by Randall Robinson with Open Lens, Akashic Books Open Lens imprint, who he thanks. I found it, Prof, because I thought Monday night perhaps, but these are that perhaps there were other people involved, but these are the sisters involved. In the acknowledgments, he says, I'm especially appreciative that Makeda, which is the name of the book, Makeda, that's the name of the central figure, that Makeda has been chosen as the first book to bear Akashic Books' new Open Lens imprint. For this, I owe a special thanks to Marva Allen, Marie Brown, Janet Hill Talbert, and Regina Brooks, as well as to the publisher, Johnny Temple of Akashic Books. 3 Black women at the center of this. Yeah, this was published in 2011. This is his last book, Makeda. It's set in Virginia, but it's set globally. He's bringing Africa through this grandmother who never seen with her physical eyes, but every time she dreams, she travels the African world. And he talks about his inspirations for that, which include John Henry Clark, who he had a lifelong relationship with. His readings on the Dogon people, he writes about that, all that. He says, this story is fictional, but all the historical research is accurate. That's Makeda. We could do that. So, or we could end with today, the one, as I said, might be the one that just, it brings it all together for this man who in many ways was a Secretary of State for the Black world, and gives us an answer to the question of how we love. Do we love a country? How can you love a country and don't love the people? It's called Defending the Spirit. And I just want to mention a few things from it. He begins by talking about his upbringing in Richmond, Virginia. And he talks about his parents. He writes in here about the only time he saw his father cry. Now they say he grew up in a rat-infested house, but he writes in, my daddy would trap the rats every night, drown them. My mother used little tin patches to cover up the holes. They made that place a home, and then they sold the house and they moved to a white neighborhood. And he said it became black right quick. This is like that raising the sun moment. This is what he writes. He said, I saw my daddy crying once alone in his bedroom. I had never seen him cry, and it frightened me. I asked Mama about it. She told me it was because he had gone into debt to buy the house. He had signed a 20-year mortgage, committing himself to payments of $50 a month. Daddy, our family's sole breadwinner, was mortally afraid of debt. Remember, debt's one of them 3 categories that Chris Manjapra is writing about.
Mm-hmm.
He said he worked longer hours, doubled up on the mortgage payments, and paid off the loan in 12 years. You funky ass New York Times. I know you had a word limit because it's only Randall Robinson and you couldn't get away with not writing one, but then you're going to start with the rat-infested, but his parents were loving, they both teachers. You need to do, could you reread the book? I know you're writing fast because you didn't expect him to pass, but come on now. He talks about police. He got a little car after he went to, he said, my brother Max was a superstar in the school. My sister got straight A's and she got 1B. It's still disputed to this day in her whole academic career. You know what I'm saying? My other sister, my baby sister, she was brilliant. Me, I was messing around. You know, I played basketball. He went to Norfolk State on a basketball scholarship. He was 6'5". He played basketball for Norfolk State. Then he got drafted, went into the military, and they told him, the brothers was like, look, man, you can get out. They're going to send us to Vietnam, but you are like a few weeks on the other side of the release they'll give you if you're in school. So he got out, and they sent his group to Vietnam, and many of those cats never came back. He came this close. Robinson came out. He came back, went to Virginia Union. This is where, as we talked about on Monday night, Reverend Wright told us, you know, his family and Randall Robinson's family know each other well, been in each other's weddings. Reverend Wright was on the board of Trans-Africa. Of course, Reverend Wright went to Virginia Union. And of course, the Virginia Union trains those great ministers, Samuel DeWitt Proctor, so many others. Mentioning all that in the context. Now, at least one of Randall Robinson's children graduated from Howard. I haven't seen Howard release a statement, but I'm sure they will at some point. Oh, by the way, I should also point out something that many of us know, but then there may be some people who here who don't know. The White House released a statement on Randall Robinson, but it wasn't Joe Biden, it was Kamala Harris. Shout out to the Vice President of the United States for doing that. I would like to believe, I have no way of knowing, but I would like to believe that she said that, you know, I want to be the one to do it. Now, Joe, let me do this. You know, whatever it does or doesn't mean, it came from Kamala Harris. It did not come from Joe Biden. And that's okay, because Randall Robinson fought with U.S. presidents sequentially. You understand? He talks about the fact that when he was in the Army, he read a memoir of sorts by E.R. Braithwaite. We talked about E.R. Braithwaite when Sidney Poitier from the Bahamas made transition, of course, because they made one of Braithwaite's books, To Serve with Love, into a movie. He said, that's when I began to think about Africa very differently. Now, he would live long enough that his mother, as she turned 90, got a chance to go to Africa. I'll tell you about that in a second. I'm going to keep this short. Harvard Law School. He comes back and goes to Harvard Law School. He said, they don't teach you how to be a lawyer at Harvard Law School. They teach you all the major theories and all that. And this is where the thing really makes you mad as hell. Well, he starts with this, actually. Let me just go here for a minute, part 1, where he's getting Cambridge, Massachusetts in winter 1967. He says, I've arrived from segregationist Virginia to attend Harvard Law School. Our first year class of more than 500 students is divided into 4 sections. My section is sitting through a torts lecture given by Professor Charles Freed. Tall and bespectacled, Professor Freed was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1935, was educated at Princeton and Oxford and Columbia, and he goes on to talk about all his classmates, some of his classmates there of the 121. Seated halfway up the ascending bowl to Professor Freed's left is William Weld, a future Republican governor of Massachusetts. At eye level with Professor Freed, and to the right is Samuel Berger, who, like Messrs. Sanders Peirce and Weld, will find his way into public service, eventually advising President William Jefferson Clinton from the post of assistant to the president for national security affairs. To Mr. Berger's right, and 2 rows behind, sits Mark Joseph Green, late of Cornell University in Great Neck, New York. By the mid-90s, Mr. Green will have nailed down a position as New York City's public advocate and a statewide reputation as a liberal Democrat. This is the same Mark Green that at the retirement, at Randall Robinson's retirement, you hear Earl Graves and Ed Lewis talking about they was protesting out there after the death of Amadou Diallo, and they was putting fire to Mark Green, a classmate of Randall Robinson at Harvard. And he goes on and says, Freed is talking about nuisance is a theory in torts. And Angie Porter here to walk us through this. Nuisance is a theory in torts. How do you create a nuisance? Some kind of actionable offense, something that's so offensive that you can take somebody to court for creating a nuisance. And Freed asks, can anyone think of an actionable nuisance we haven't touched on today? He's talking about grating noise, belching smoke. What about Black people moving into a neighborhood? Suggests Mark Joseph Green, liberal Democrat of Cornell University in Great Neck, New York. Robinson writes, a thoughtful discussion ensues. Henry Sanders looks at me. There are 3 Black people in the room. Randall Robinson and Hank Sanders are 2 of the 3. Hank Sanders, I love this brother, and his wife. They all went to school together. Hank Sanders and his wife, Fire Rose, also known, Fire Rose Touré, also known as Fire Rose Touré. They are Harvard Law School graduates and lawyers who have taken their law degrees and waged holy war on white nationalism in Alabama for the rest of their lives. They still down there in Selma. Fire Rose and Hank Sanders are the brainchildren and the driving force behind the Selma Bridge crossing every year. They were classmates of Randall Robinson at Harvard Law. This is Hank Sanders' novel, Death of a Fat Man. It's kind of an autobiographical novel. It's about a father and son, a father and daughter, but it's a brilliant kind of meditation on struggle. Hank Sanders, brilliant lawyer, his wife, brilliant lawyer, classmates of Randall Robinson. So he says, a thoughtful discussion ensues. Henry Sanders looks at me. We 5 Blacks, in fact, it's 5 of them, sorry. We 5 Blacks, in fact, all look at each other out of 121. Our faces betray little. In any case, the privileged young white scholars are oblivious. There are legal arguments to be mustered, pro and con. I've been in that room. Not this room, but at Ohio State, I've been in that room. Now, I didn't look at nobody else. I may have looked at Belethia a couple of times. Watkins, we was in class together. But when one of them, I remember, I'll never forget that day in contracts. We was talking about Williams versus Walker Thomas. That's a DC furniture store. The whole thing where they was overcharging Black and poor people for furniture. And then if you bought one more thing, they put that on the tab too. Even if you paid off everything else, if you miss one payment, they come take everything out your house. And so it's a case that is used in contracts law in most law schools to teach the theory of unconscionability in contracts. There are some contracts that are so unconscionable that they can't be enforced. Contract is basically offer, acceptance, and consideration. Well, that's just, I done paid over the years for this furniture 15 times. Then I came in here and bought a nightstand and I missed one payment. And then you came and took everything that I paid for. Williams versus Walker Thomas furniture. Hand goes up. Professor Sheldon Halpern, now dead. Professor Sheldon Halpern, we organized against him. That's a story for another day. Halpern, from the front of the room, it's probably maybe 150 students in there, maybe 10 or 11 Black students scattered around. Maybe not that many, come to think of it. Somebody state the facts in Williams versus Walker Thomas. A hand goes up, middle of the auditorium. Yes. Plaintiff was a welfare mother who went into, this white girl kept doing the stat. My hand is up now. I'm looking at Halpern dead ass in the face while she's talking. Everybody now like, what is he doing? So she finishes, Mr. Carr, yeah, I didn't see welfare mother anywhere in the statement of facts. This is the guy who used to wax and drone on about how when he worked at one of the benefits of working at the big firm was they bring you lunch, the ladies come and feed you and you get to eat and all the benefits, and they do your cleaning if you want to just leave your suits. And I mean, just in the middle, this is why y'all go to law school, so you can even. And then this is the guy who, oh man, we used to battle, and he had a reputation. They said no Black can ever get above a C in Sheldon Halpern's class. I thought it was supposed to be blind grading. Anyway, so I wasn't in the room like Hank Sanders and Randall Robinson, but I've been in the echo of that room because I'm 58 years old. My parents were raised in apartheid. They were raised in the lost cause. They were raised in Jim and Jane Crow. So it's almost like that ghost lining. We have to tell these stories to our children. Adolph Reed is right. You got to pass these on because they won't experience that. They think you think that's your friend. You think that's and your friend thinks you their friend until, as you say, like that little white boy on the boat in the coming, they grow up and say, you want your structure or you want humanity? Oh, I'm picking things over people. You done lost your damn mind. Now, you my friend. You can come over here. I might even give you a diversity, equity, inclusion job till I figure out you ain't gonna burn the country down, which one I'm gonna fire all of y'all. But right now, let's, please don't. I thought we was friends. Come on now. Give me some dap. Anyway, Randall Robinson goes on. He says, they just talked about it. He says, the discussion of whether or not the mere presence of blacks constitutes an inherent nuisance swirls around the 5 blacks. We say nothing. We cannot dignify insult with reasoned rebuttal. The choice is between ventilated rage and silence. We choose silence. He says, doubtless Mr. Green will not remember his attempt to expand the definition of nuisance as a tort. 30 years later, I will not have forgotten. I'm going to just, let me put my timer on. I'm only do 5 more minutes because we're over 2 hours now. We've been keeping it under and kind of dialing back. I just want to mention this. Maybe we'll talk more about Randall Robinson next week because we haven't even touched his life. Randall Robinson finished that law degree. He practiced law for a year. That's it. Me and him had that conversation the first time, man. We pitted me over. We was talking. I said, man, I wasn't going to practice. He said, I didn't practice. I said, yeah, you didn't practice. He said, no, man, shit. I took the bar. Only 3 blacks passed the bar in Massachusetts that year, and everybody else who failed sued. And then they gave everybody the test again, and every one of the blacks that sued and all the blacks that took it that time passed. At which point, we all realized it ain't no such thing as a blind test. How the hell they all passed, and it's the same people? Anyway, he tried his best to practice law, and then he got fired with another sister because they were assigned to basically be public defenders for young black people in Boston, black and brown people. And they said a black person should be running this unit. And when they wouldn't back down on the demand, they got rid of him. He worked 3 more years in Boston as a community organizer. And then he was able to, well, actually, before that, he talked to the dean, Walter Leonard. I think Walter Leonard ended up being president of Fisk, come think of it. Walter Leonard was the dean, was an associate dean at Harvard Law School, and actually between that and doing the 3 years of community organizer, he went to the black dean, as they called him, and said, "We want to go to Africa." Who? Me, Hank, and Rose Sanders. What? We ain't got no fellowship for y'all. Dean Leonard went to the Ford Foundation, and they made up a fellowship, and that's how Randall Robinson got to Africa the first time. And he writes about that in Defending the Spirit. And then when he got there, he began to see the class politics. He began to see the difference. He said, we can do good work, but he says, we should go back to the United States and work for Africa from the United States, since the United States is the source of many of these problems. And that's what he basically did for the rest of his life. Charlie Cobb actually also was in East Africa at the time. Remember, they were in Tanzania. He worked for Charles Diggs. He worked for Bill Clay on Capitol Hill. After he finished as community organizer, he's got this degree. He comes down to DC and he starts working for Charles Diggs. Charles Diggs, out of Michigan, was at the time chair of the Committee on the District of Columbia for the Democratic Party, and he was the chair of the subcommittee on Africa. But he got caught up in scandal. And even though with 20 plus years seniority, remember Charles Diggs is the brother who went down as a congressman from Michigan to the Emmett Till trial. Diggs got caught up in scandal. He wasn't good with money and numbers. He tried to, put everybody on the payroll. He took money and sell. They got him out the paint. And had he stayed in, Randall Robinson writes, he probably would have been the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee because he had the seniority. He said, Diggs messing up and then giving an opening for them to get rid of him hurt Africa in ways that we will never know, because he would have been the chair of foreign relations, not just the subcommittee on Africa. He says Diggs got together with Andy Young, who was in Congress at the time, and they had a big meeting in DC to come together and put together a policy group to deal with Africa. Again, generationally. This doesn't mean these guys are heroes. These women and men are all heroes and not. What it does mean, however, is that there was a different consciousness toward Africa in the 60s and 70s, even among Black elected officials. The elected officials now are not those elected officials. That's 3 generations away. These elected officials never knew the whip. Now, God bless people like Lauren Underwood, who is a registered nurse herself, who's a congresswoman, who has been pushing for maternal health legislation, who's been doing that. That's absolutely right. She's out of that same Illinois where that mayoral election is going to take place in Chicago. But let's be very clear about this. How we deal with foreign policy now is so much more punk ass because loving a country, or at least cosplaying it to the degree that you won't say nothing. When you look at this retirement thing for Randall Robinson, go on C-SPAN and look at it. Person after person is excoriating the United States government, not just on South Africa, but on Cuba, not just on Cuba, but Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago and policy toward Haiti. Not just that, but what's going on in Africa. Randall Robinson said, I lived long enough to see how the black bourgeoisie emerged. He said, I went in the room where the Nigerians came over here, and they told me, you need to stop talking about American foreign policy in Nigeria. While you criticizing it, you hurting us. You might mess up our money. How much will it take for you to be quiet? We'll go up to $1 million. This was when, Nigerians know what I'm talking about. This is when Abacha was the person in charge. After IBB, after Babangida. And Robinson is in the room like, because he said the one thing you must never compromise on is your principles. Let me pause here. We could pick up some more next. We're going to say a few more things about Randall Robinson, but maybe that's a good place to pause for now. The one place you don't pause, you don't compromise is your principles. Randall Robinson, whatever mistakes he made or didn't make, being human in the world, whatever ways me, one thing was clear as he moved through the world on principle. Oh, I'll say one more thing about the retirement party. Trans-Africa after 2015 kind of just silences. He retired in 2002. Bill Fletcher took over as president. Danny Glover took over as chair of the board. They moved to Trans-Africa Forum, more of a think tank kind of informing people about Africa and the Caribbean and Africans in the U.S., African diaspora. Robinson speaks last. If you go look at the C-SPAN, he says, I was at home and the phone rang. I said, hello? I said, can I speak to Randall Robinson? He said, yes. Before this, he opened his remarks to saying, I'm going to be brief, but there's a commercial IBM does, and it says, what did he say? He said, and that was the moment I knew, something like that. He says, no, and then you know, I think was it, and then you know. That is a commercial. Some of y'all, if y'all knew this IBM commercial back in the 70s, please, put it in the chat. He says, so I answered the phone. Hello? Yes. Can I speak to Randall Robinson? Yes. Yes, I'm an intern at Trans-Africa. Okay. He says, we want to invite you to something, but we need a CV. Do you have a CV you can share with us? This is an intern at Trans-Africa that he founded in 1977. He said, well, I would think you would have something on file. The young lady intern now says, well, they said we would have something, but it's been misplaced. And then you know. In other words, what he was saying is, you stay on the wall as long as you can, but each generation that you pass the baton to is going to have to run its own lap. And Trans-Africa today is not when the Trans-Africa ran around. So we'll talk some more about this next week, but that's where we're going to restore this memory. You know what I'm saying? And then you know. You can only do what you can do. You know what I'm saying? Anyway.
I tried to find that particular speech. I couldn't, but I found one because I think people need to hear his voice and see him. So I'll play this on the way out. But I wanted, first of all, thank you. Thank you. This is important. As you were talking, I was like, the fact that we didn't have an obituary for him, it took almost a week, and then it was disrespectful, made me, I have to reach out to my editor and Ahmad. I was like, listen, now we're going to take up the task. I assign obituary writing to my class every semester. It's
you told us about that.
Yeah, what I do, because it's a format, it's a particular style, but it's also the best writers, because those are the keepers of the history, the keepers of the memory. Those are the storytellers, obituary writers, classic obituary writers are some of the best writers at newspapers, right?
No,
Because
no,
it requires research. You got to know stuff. It's depth of writing. You have to bring these people to life. And most obituaries are written before people make transition. So that's why the format is what it is. It's the name, claim to fame, that they died when. Those first 2 paragraphs get tacked on afterwards. So the fact that they didn't have one ready for him.
Prof, let me just say, I want you to finish. I just want to mention right quick that in 2016 they did a documentary called Obit on the New York Times obituary writers. I made a point of traveling to see it. It just shows, it underscores what these are some of the most remarkable researchers. I was sitting there like, wow. Anyway, please continue. But yes, to your point, I see why you have them trained to learn write obits. You got to know stuff.
Yeah. So Yara, we're gonna pluck a couple of my students. I'm gonna put them in the hub, and that's gonna be because none of our ancestors should make transition without having this. What you're doing right now. So they should be honored, and they should be honored by people who knows what the hell they're talking about, not some hack trying to piece something together. Maybe somebody said in the chat, throwing it in Chat GPT and then putting it out in the universe, because that's what's happening now.
My God.
So thank you for your deep knowledge.
And Kichi, yeah, Jelani, and Kichi Taifas was excellent because she knew him well. There have been people, right? But I love this though. So we're gonna have an obit writing unit.
Got to. We have. I mean, it's stunningly clear. Like I absolutely expected there to be an obituary on Sunday, and there wasn't one on Monday, and there wasn't one on Tuesday. And then when you just read the one that they actually put out, it's like it's sad. It's sad. Then this is 100 years from now, how this man will be remembered, because that's the staple.
Now
we're going to go to right.
100 years from now, it may not be no New York Times, but guess what's going to be here?
Yes, we will. We will. On that note, baseball fans, I followed Dr. J. I followed Dr. J, who said I wasn't a baseball fan, but I was a Reggie Jackson fan. I was never a baseball fan, but I was a Hank Aaron fan because of my grandmama, and I was absolutely a Reggie Jackson fan. And I watched Reggie, so that we're gonna get homework. So I would like us to maybe have a little discussion about.
I know we can't really go, but tease us. What did you think?
Oh, first of all, the conversation with Hank Aaron.
Oh yes,
everyone must. That's y'all's homework. Watch Reggie on Amazon Prime just for the conversation between Reggie Jackson and Hank Aaron, and Reggie Jackson and Derek Jeter.
And Jeter.
That conversation, I was like, okay, Jeter. All right. I see.
You know what? Talk about governance and social structure. First of all, Henry Aaron, the most dignified. I ain't never seen Henry Aaron talk like that. And yeah, if you've never seen him, that means
Dr. J. I was like, okay. The conversations that they were having were and this is the importance of him being alive. And he said at the top, I never wanted to participate in anything like this. Like this is not what I do. But I think he realizes in this moment that if he doesn't tell his story, we're gonna have the New York Times out there and other places bastardizing people's history and memories.
And watch this. Reggie Jackson, 1946. It's like this is that generation. I got to tell y'all, because if I don't tell y'all, you're going to mess around and mistake these people for somebody else. That's right.
So powerful. So that's homework next week, and then we'll do a deeper dive, and we'll do all of that.